Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to get started. And I have to take off my mask to be able to read. Hang on. All right. Whoops. Let's unfog it first. All right. We're very fortunate to have our first speaker is Carol Velasquez Richardson. She's the program coordinator of the Quinn Museum and Cultural Center of Alachua County. She's worked with the Samuel Proctor Oral History radio program at UF. She's a board member at the Arts Council of Alachua County, an advisory board member for WUFT-TV. She's chair of Alachua City Parks, Recreation and Culture. And she's the theater director and station manager of WUBA-FM in High Springs, Florida. She is also a review panelist for the state of Florida's Division of Cultural Affairs in Media Arts, where she reviews applications from television, radio, community arts, museums, universities, and film festivals throughout Florida. So without further ado, let's have Carol come up. And this is also a Zoom event, so you're talking to more people than you realize.
Oh, wonderful. Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. First of all, I'd like to say thank you to the Writers Alliance of Gainesville for having me here today. This has been a wonderful weekend of just great literary arts. I'm so happy to see this happening in the city of Gainesville and Alachua County. So thank you so much for all that you do. My piece today is entitled Negro Spirituals to Black Education. Now, I can't sing, so I'm going to give you some lyrics to some songs. So if you're able to sing them, you're more than welcome to. But this particular piece, I want you to just really enjoy it. And I'm going to just take you back in time to a time when African Americans really had it kind of rough in this country. So the first piece that I'm going to lyrics that I'm going to say and not sing comes, you'll recognize it. When Israel was in Egypt's land, oppressed so hard they could not stand, go down Moses, way down in Egypt's land, tell, O Pharaoh, thus said the Lord, bold Moses said, if not, I'll smite your firstborn dead. Let my people go. Go down Moses, way down in Egypt's land. Tell, O Pharaoh, let my people go. No more shall they in bondage toil. Let my people go. Let them come out with Egypt's spoil. Let my people go. We need not always weep and mourn. Let my people go and wear these slavery chains forlorn. Let my people go. Your foes shall not before you stand. Let my people go. And you will possess fair Canaan's land. Let my people go. Great, thank you. Negro spirituals or Black spirituals or spiritual music is a genre of Christian music that's purely and solely the creation of generations of Black Americans, which merge African cultural heritage with the experiences of being held in bondage in slavery at the first during the transatlantic slave trade, the largest and one of the most inhumane forced migrations in recorded human history. And for centuries afterwards, through the domestic slave trade, spirituals encompasses the sing songs, work songs, and plantation songs that evolved into the blues and gospel songs of the church. In the 19th century, the word spirituals referred to all these subcategories or folk songs. While they were often rooted in biblical stories, they also described the extreme hardship endured by African Americans who were enslaved from the 17th century until the 1860s. The emancipation altering mainly the nature but not the continuation of slavery in many forms. Many new derivative music genres emerge from the spiritual songcraft. Prior to the end of the US Civil War and emancipation, spirituals were originally an oral tradition passed from one slave generation to the next. Biblical stories were memorized, then translated into songs. Following emancipation, the lyrics of spirituals were published in print. Ensembles such as the Fisk Jubilee Singers from Fisk University, established in 1871, popularized spirituals, bringing them to a wider, even international audience. In Africa, music had been central to people's lives. Music making permeated important life events and daily activities. However, the white colonists of North America were alarmed by and frowned upon the slaves' African-infused way of worship because they considered it to be idolatrous and wild. As a result, the gatherings were often banned and had to be conducted in clandestine manner. The African population in the American colonies had initially been introduced to Christianity in the 17th century. Uptake of the religion was relatively slow at first, but the slave population was fascinated by biblical stories containing parallels to their own lives and created spirituals that retold narratives about biblical figures like Daniel and Moses. As Africanized Christianity took hold of the slave population, spirituals served as a way to express the community's new faith as well as its sorrows and hopes. One central character in the Old Testament in many Negro spirituals is Joshua. According to Robert Hampshire of Christianity.com, while Joshua was far from perfect, his boldness, faith, leadership, and even recovery from failure not only gave him a spot in God's Hall of Faith in the book of Hebrews, but Joshua was so lionized among the Jewish people that many parents named their children after him. What happened at the Jericho, what led to the famous Negro spiritual, Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho? And what is that connection to Black education? Joshua was the successor of Moses for God's people. He was used to experiencing battles, miraculous events, divine interventions, and difficult situations. But Jericho seemed different. Now, it was not just a sea and a wilderness to deal with. It was a heavily fortified city that stood between God's people, the Israelites, and the promised land. Jericho had a massive and strong wall around it that the Israelite army had no hope of getting past. And even if they did, they would have to face an enemy army. But the Israelites had one major player on their team that Jericho did not. The God of the universe. God had promised Joshua the following: "No man shall be able to stand before you all the days of your life. Be strong and courageous, for you shall cause this people to inherit the land that I swore to their fathers to give them. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left. You may have good success wherever you go. Be strong and courageous. Do not be frightened and do not be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." Joshua 1:5-9. The Old Testament story led to the creation of Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho. As I said, I can't sing. I'll just share the lyrics, but if you know it, please join in. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua with the valley of Jericho, and the walls came a-tumbling down. Right up the walls of Jericho, he marched up with spear in hand. "Go blow that ram's horn," Joshua cried, "because the battle is in my hand." Joshua, Jericho, Jericho. Joshua fit the battle of Jericho, and You may talk about the kings of Gideon. You may talk about the man of Saul, but there's none like, oh, Joshua at the Battle of Jericho. Joshua, Battle of Awesome. Woo! 7 years before the recorded version of Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho, Alan Quinn Jones began his teaching job in 1915 at Sawdust School and Church in rural North Florida. Imagine 25 African-American children, grades 1 through 18, crammed together in a single small room. There were no desks and one wood blackboard. Chalk was brought with pennies collected by the students. Textbooks were not supplied, so adopted books were used. At lunchtime, students bought their homemade meals from paper bags. A neighbor's well provided drinking water from a bucket and dipper. At the end of the school day, students used tree branches to sweep the floor. In 1921, Jones moved to Gainesville to become the first principal of Union Academy. And in 1923, he became the principal of the brand new African-American school, Lincoln High School, where he was called working principal. In addition to his administrative duties, he taught chemistry, Latin, and math. At the heart of A. Quinn Jones and Black educators was the Black church and the spirituals. It was the teaching and the spirituals that gave them the strength to continue to fight oppression of racism and inequality of the day. Through hard work and determination, the spirituals gave Black educators the ability to tear down walls. I would like to say something to you. I want to give you, A. Quinn Jones approached the elementary school students, and he gave them these words as they were getting ready to leave elementary school and move over to high school. And I want you to put this in the context. We're talking 1925. Rosewood had just happened in Cedar Key in 1923. When we're talking about Black education and we're talking about Black educators, we're talking about people that were being ostracized, that were being lynched, that was being killed, but yet they saw the value in education, and they understood that education and educating their children was going to be the success of their future. So to A. Quinn Jones provided these words to the little small elementary school students. I wish to express my appreciation of the invitation which came to me to have a part on this program. I wish further to congratulate the teachers of this institution for the very earnest endeavors, for their patience in dealing with boys and girls of this community, with the hope of inspiring them to get a greater inspiration, a greater vision of the things that make for life and more worthy ideals of citizenship. The parents and guardians of these boys and girls are to be commended for the self-sacrificing they have made, too numerous to mention in this short space of time. May I take this opportunity to congratulate the students and pupils of this school on the success that many of you have attained in completing your schoolwork successfully, as evidenced by getting a promotion to a higher grade. This is an achievement in which you should take great amount of pride. You have reached successful mileposts and have learned to conquer your fears. There's no doubt there have been periods of discouragement and times when the task seemed difficult, but now that the year's work has come to an end, as far as school is concerned, your course is finished for this year. So I would like to say, on behalf of the A. Quinn Jones Museum and Cultural Center, I would like to thank the Writers Alliance of Gainesville for recognizing the voice of Black educators, recognizing the contributions of A. Quinn Jones Museum. And I would like to invite you to the museum, which is located in Gainesville on 1013 Northwest 7th Avenue, as we work to preserve and to conquer those fractions that tries to keep Black education, Black life, out of the mainstream. We work to keep it there for you. Thank you. So at this time, I will take some questions. And I would like to also say, I'd like to thank E. Stanley Richardson, Alachua County Poet Laureate, who provided some help with this poetry. So I want to say thank you so much, Stan, for helping me. Any questions?
What are the hours of the museum?
We are open to the public Tuesday through Thursday from 1 to 5, other times by appointments. And we also do have book talks and live music on the patio. So the museum is basically open anytime you'd like to come. Thank you. Yes. I believe 1957 with George Allen becoming the first law student there. Any other questions? Thank you. None? Mm-hmm.
That's what I was thinking. It seemed like I came up here in 1970. It seemed like things were not integrated and then suddenly they were.
Right. And the in 1970 is when Lincoln was closed. Lincoln High School was closed, and then it was forced, as far as we're concerned, forced integration. And so, but he gave this commencement address in 1957 to the students. Yes.
Do you know any history about why it was Lincoln that was closed as opposed to Gainesville High School?
That's another subject, but we, so if you would ask some of the folks from Lincoln, they felt that it was a destroying of their community and their culture and their way of life. Because with Lincoln, unlike a lot of schools, it wasn't just built by the school board, it was built by the Rosenwald. Julius Rosenwald had a fund, and so he went through the South working with the African-American communities to build schools. And Lincoln was one of those first Rosenwald school, but it was part of the culture of the community. In Gainesville, they did it all over the country. Instead of keeping these schools, they tore them down. Yes.
I just want to say, I think it was a strategy. I think it was just folks who were in the South knew eventually they would have to do it. And how would they go about doing it? So I think they really wanted to give a semblance of integration, but also not take away some power, which was there. So schools integration
Right.
on their terms. Exactly.
Right.
Out from a large way. So in a large way, it was a bank.
Right.
So
One thing I just recently heard, and I don't know if I may have been listening to a Matheson talk, but when they did that in 1970, they also closed Buchholz, but Buchholz was, when they got a new school, they got to keep their name. When they closed Lincoln, there was no school, the new school was Eastside High School. So that was the other question, why couldn't, instead of calling Eastside, why not call it Lincoln High School? Yes.
That's right.
I have it because I'm a Rayham, I'm a East. I mean, I know it is Eastside High School, but that might be something they could do. I know Lincoln Middle School, the Lincoln Alumni Association is working on building a memorial wall at the current Lincoln Middle School, which is where the second Lincoln, the first Lincoln is actually in front of A. Quinn Jones Museum, but the second Lincoln is where Lincoln Middle School currently is. Any other questions? Well, thank you so much. I appreciate being here today. And over here is a photo of A. Quinn Jones, and over here is actually A. Quinn Jones, much older. This is his wife, Frederica Jones, who was a teacher at Lincoln, and she also was in the Greater Bethel AME Church, and so this is their church. So thank you.
If you'll wait just a moment, I'd like to introduce our chairperson, Pat Karen.
Okay.
Hi. Hello, and thank you, Carol. That was fascinating.
Thank
I
you.
learned a lot, and this is for you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh. Thank you.
Thank you.
Carol.
We're not done with you.
Oh my goodness. Y'all want me to stay?
I would like to thank you for being our chairman last year.
Oh,
We didn't get together in person because it was an online book festival, but
thank you.
your contributions were just as important as
Thank you.
any other activity. In fact, maybe even more because it was the year of COVID. So,
Thank
you very much.
Thank you. And I'm assuming that everyone is here is a fan of WAG, but if you're not, please join their membership. They do some wonderful things in the community. As a member of the Alachua County Arts Council, we're really just so pleased to have you here and to be able to support the literary arts. Sometimes it gets lost behind the performers. So thank you so much for everything that you do, and thank you for the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you, Carol, for those wonderful words. We would not have been able to put on this book festival without sponsors. We have had people in the community who were very generous to us. I'd like to start with Visit Gainesville. I believe there's someone here from Visit Gainesville. We'd like to give you this certificate of appreciation. They supported us financially, and they also gave us those cute little gift bags and the alligator pens that were in them. So
Thank you.
thank you so much. Oh, I guess Stanley's our photographer today. Okay.
Here, let me put it here.
Yes, there we go.
Okay. Thank
Thank
you.
you. We appreciate it so much.
We appreciate all that you do. Thank you.
I have a few others I want to announce. Chick-fil-A, is there anyone here from Chick-fil-A? They donated they donated a bunch of coupons for free chicken sandwiches and cookies and brownies for our authors and our volunteers. So we appreciate all the help they did. Cox Communication. Anyone hear from that? Our contact person was Marie Tertaglione, and they gave us not only financial support, but also free advertising, which we graciously accepted. Hunters Crossing Publix. Justin Glazer. Okay. They contributed crayons for the children's section, which we appreciate very much. Huntington Learning Center. I don't know who the contact person was, but they supported us financially, and we appreciate that. We will get these to the recipients sometime after today. And Ken Campbell, I don't see him here. He is a friend. He's in our my writing pod, and he also is very much interested in children's learning.
What was the name of his company?
I don't remember.
Great Lakes.
Great Leaps, yes. They do a lot to help children who are struggling to read, to help them learn to read. And Ken was very generous with a contribution from his company. And I wish he was here today to receive it, but I'll give it to him at our next pod meeting. And that's all I have right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. You're doing a great job as chair for the Sunshine State Book Festival. There's a lot of work that goes on behind the scenes that nobody knows about. Our next speaker will start at 2 o'clock, but he's here. He actually has books for sale, and we have coffee, drinks, and snacks in the next room. So help yourself to the coffee and some soft drinks and snacks. And when you, we'll start again at exactly 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.
Drawing. So if you won a book in the book drawing, this is your chance to pick it up. At the end of the day, if you donated a book and it's still here, then you can take it home with you. And the ones that are not picked up by winners or authors, we will be donating to a charitable cause. We haven't decided which one yet, but that's what's going to happen to them. Another thing, you may see our COVID book over there. It's on sale for the book festival for $10. The usual price is what, $14, $15? So it's on sale today. This was a collaboration between the Matheson Museum and the Writers Alliance of Gainesville. It's local lives in a global pandemic, stories from North Central Florida. And some of the contributors are in this room now, and it's a bunch of really interesting bits from the pandemic. So I wanted to announce these things.
Some of you may already have met is Robert Knight. He has been selling his books at the back, so some of you may have already had a chance to him. We're very fortunate to have him here. Robert Knight is an environmental scientist. If we could please keep it down on the back, please, and if you have cell phones, be sure to turn them off. Thank you. Robert Knight is an environmental scientist and the founder of the Howard T. Odum Florida Springs Institute. He's conducted assessments for many of the Florida's largest springs and developed many springs restoration plans. He's the founder and president of Wetland Solutions. He planned and designed Gainesville's popular Sweetwater Wetlands Park, which I'm sure some of you have been to. It's turned into one of the most popular parks in Gainesville. He's also served as an adjunct professor at the University of Florida, teaching graduate level courses in springs ecology, treatment wetland design, and he has 4 books, all of which will be available for you after the event as well. He had Silent Springs as one of his books, Moving from Tragedy to Hope, Death by 1,000 Cuts, an anthology of spring opinions, Silver Springs and the Liquid Heart, and Saving Florida Springs, which is something we all care about. So I'm very happy to introduce to the Sunshine State Book Festival, Robert Knight. Thank you, Robert.
Thank you, Allison. And thanks to Matheson for having this event here today. And thanks to the Writers Alliance of North Florida, or of Florida, of Gainesville, for sponsoring the whole festival. My wife has been a member in the past. I don't know if she's still attending, but she was selling her book, Idlewild Cowgirls, yesterday at the park. So that went well. So I'm pleased to be here. And I don't have a presentation other than I just have some bullet points. I want to go over some things with you. I want to talk a little bit about who I am and what my history is and things about the Springs Institute and show off some of the things that we're doing because I work for a nonprofit, a private nonprofit, the Florida Springs Institute. And can you hear me all right? Is this all right? My major professor was Howard T. Odum. How many of you knew Dr. Odum? Not many. He was an emeritus professor here, very famous in the field of ecology and invented the whole new field of systems ecology. And he got his start here at University of Florida in the 1950s, studying Silver Springs. And he was right out of graduate school as a limnologist, somebody that studied freshwater systems. And he looked around when he moved to Gainesville in 1950 and said, what's neat about Florida? Well, the springs are the neatest thing about Florida. He was the first one to recognize that. And he went and did a 4-year study of Silver Springs and really developed a whole field of systems ecology based on that study, looking at the energy flow going through Silver Springs, looking at how the organisms, the plants, the animals were organized and how they interacted, and the feedback mechanisms that made Silver Springs one of the most productive natural ecosystems in the world, more productive than a highly cultivated cornfield, like a tropical rainforest, like a coral reef. So anyway, he learned things about springs, which then affected him throughout his career, and he went to a number of universities. But fortunately, he ended up back in Gainesville in 1970. I met him in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, when I was working on my degree there. And then he moved to Gainesville right after that. And I got to follow him here later in the 1970s. And I got to restudy Silver Springs, which was just a miracle for anybody to have the opportunity to do that. Because it was just a wonderful place in the 70s. It was a magical spring. It was unpolluted. It was still had its historic flows. It was just, it's full of wildlife, Silver Springs. But actually, the reason he wanted me to study Silver Springs is because he had noticed that the fish populations had changed between the 1950s when he worked there and the 1970s when he came back. He would take field trips down there, and the fish weren't there the way they had been, and that he remembered and quantified back in the 1950s. And he suspected it was because of the Rodman Dam on the Ocklawaha River was blocking the fish, the migration of fish. And these fish that were in Silver Springs, especially channeled catfish, striped bass, mullet, those fish moved back and forth to the ocean or to at least the big rivers like the St. Johns River. And they were being blocked. So that's what he had me study. I came back and studied not only the fish populations, but the fish food, the insects that were there, the algae, and the overall productivity of Silver Springs to see how it had changed. And that then was my graduate work, but I went to try to get a job, and there was nobody spending any money on springs at the time, and I couldn't get a job teaching. It was highly competitive time for people teaching environmental science. And so I ended up in consulting with C.H. Tulum Hill, which was a company, a Western company that essentially moved east and set up an office in Gainesville and ended up doing a lot of work in the Eastern United States. It's a world-size engineering firm, and luckily they were very interested in treatment wetlands, wetlands that were being used for water quality improvement. And Dr. Odum had actually started that too. When he came to University of Florida, he got a grant from the Rockefeller Rand Foundation to set up the Center for Wetlands at the University of Florida and to have, about 20, 25 graduate students study cypress domes near Gainesville that were receiving treated effluent wastewater. And that really started the field of treatment wetlands. So when I went into consulting, that ended up being my whole career for about 30 years. I developed much further than Dr. Odum had the design principles for treatment wetlands and worked on projects all across the United States and to a certain extent around the world. And one of the first projects I worked on was the Sweetwater project. I conceptualized that project in 1981 for Gainesville Region Utilities. The park was not ready to accept the water coming from Main Street Wastewater Treatment Plant, which is right down here, discharges in the Sweetwater branch. It was still too dirty, too polluted for the park to want it to go on there. Marjorie Carr was actually one of the ones that prevented it from happening. So I got to meet her and be in meetings with her. So it was before its time when I first conceptualized that project. And then in around 2014 or so, people at the St. Johns River Water Management District that I knew resurrected the project because the city of Gainesville had to meet nutrient limits at Alachua Sink. And Alachua Sink was polluted according to the state, and Gainesville had needed to reduce the pollution coming down Sweetwater Branch. And that's when we finally got to do the final design on the Sweetwater Wetlands. And you know, it's history now. It's the most popular park in town. It's got, you know, hundreds of thousands of visitors a year that actually pay money to go see it and go bird watching there. And it's just a wonderful place. I'm so proud of Gainesville for doing that, because it's a solution to pollution that creates all these multiple benefits. In this case, not just the wildlife benefits, but the benefits to the people who generate the wastewater. And I recently did a field trip from the Main Street wastewater treatment plant, which is where all the raw wastewater from this part of town goes. It's quite a sight. You may want to go down and look at what's coming out of your toilet sometime and everybody else's. And then it goes through a treatment plant. It's cleaned up to a much higher level than it was in the 1980s. And then it goes into Sweetwater Branch, and Sweetwater Branch flows onto the prairie, and the whole wetland works by gravity. There's no energy that goes into the wetland other than occasional removal of all the sand and sediments and trash that comes out of Gainesville. And the water is naturally cleansed. All the nitrogen is removed. 90% of the nitrogen that remains in our wastewater is removed by that wetland. And the water then flows out over the prairie. It used to be in a canal for about 70 years. It went right to the sinkhole, right to our drinking water aquifer. And now it flows way over the prairie. It's completely at background nitrogen and phosphorus concentrations before it goes into our aquifer. And then, of course, there's the Murphy well field on the other side of town that sucks it out. And then it comes out at First Magnitude Brewery. And so in our field trip, we went to all those places, and I made sure everybody went and flushed after they had a beer. So we started the cycle over again. It's the water cycle, and it's really a cool thing to understand where your water comes from and where your water goes. And I assume that this crowd knows where your water comes from. It comes from the Florida aquifer, and that's I set up the Florida Springs Institute when I retired from consulting. I'm no longer president of Wetland Solutions. I sold it to my employees, and so I'm not doing that anymore. But I am on the other side. I'm still encouraging the use of wetlands to treat our water, because our water all over the state of Florida goes to our groundwater. Very little of our wastewater goes to surface waters in Florida, goes to the groundwater, and that has contributed to a lot of the pollution of the springs and the other water bodies in the state of Florida, which is really a critical issue right now, as our manatees are starving to death down in the Indian River Lagoon. So I don't think I followed my outline, but so I just want to talk about some of the things we do at the Springs Institute. We're a private nonprofit, completely funded by grants and donations. So anytime you're feeling generous and you care about your groundwater or your springs, feel free to come join us for an outing or something. This weekend was a 3-day conference. The Florida Springs Council, which is an advocacy group that we help establish, had a spring summit at Crystal River. And so the Springs Institute hosted a pontoon boat ride around Kings Bay, which is where Crystal River is, where the manatees are, right? And so we went down there and we got to see, and actually one of the few success stories on Springs recently is the re-vegetation of Kings Bay by eelgrass. And through a private group planting eelgrass and the good fortune of a lot of rain and higher spring flows, Kings Bay is completely dominated by eelgrass. Again, the water's clear, and the manatees have something to eat there. And that's where up to 1,000 manatees congregate in the wintertime. And my boat captain's here, Ted Greenwald, right here, who's the vice, right here in the middle, right here. He's our vice president at the Florida Springs Institute on the board of directors, and but he's also a boat captain. So we were out there in 20 and 30 mile an hour winds with a great big pontoon boat, and he navigated. We didn't hit anybody. There were people swimming everywhere looking at manatees. The manatees were all over the place. And you could see them now because the water's clear again. So that was a good experience. And we have outings like that regularly. So if you keep track of our website, you'll see one of those. And we'll do another one of the wastewater treatment plant and the water cycle in Gainesville and First Magnitude again. So it's funny, First Magnitude gets their water from Gainesville Regional Utilities that they make their beer with. That's how you make beers, with water. And all the water comes from the Florida aquifer. So if they weren't making that beer, that water would be in the springs. And all the water that we take out of the tap, that we flush our toilets with, that we wash our cars with here, unless you have a rain barrel, all of it comes from the aquifer. It comes water that would be coming out of the springs. And that's the most important thing, I think, for us to learn and for us to teach the young people is where the water comes from. It comes from rain that seeps into the ground and makes it down into the limestone, and then we pump it out of wells. And each one of those wells is like a small spring. And so there's a lot of wells now. So there's a lot of springs competing with the real springs. There's about 1,000 of these natural artesian springs in North Florida. We call it this place the land of 1,000 springs. And you probably know Silver and Ichtuckney and Gilchrist Blue and Volusia Blue and Kaiva and Weeki Wachee. These are all natural artesian springs. And we have the biggest concentration of those anywhere in the world, which is really a special thing. But we also have about 900,000 wells in North Florida. And because everybody is using that groundwater, it's easy to get. You just drill a hole in the ground and put a pump in it and pump the water out. And it's easy to get. Some people are using a lot more than others. The average use is about 100 gallons a day per person, but there are people with permits for 1 million gallons a day for their ag operation, or the city of Gainesville has one for 30 million gallons a day, which is a lot more water than the city of Gainesville needs right now. But they wanted a big permit so that we could keep developing this beautiful town that I know I sure miss the old town, but it's not the same as it was anymore. And it's because we keep pumping more and more groundwater. So I've been just devoted my retirement to this issue of springs, educating people about springs and advocating for springs and doing research at springs. We actually go out and collect the data on springs. We have citizen science doing what we call Springs Watch, which are that we have groups at 10 different spring systems now that go out on a regular basis to collect minimal data, but useful data that documents what's happening to their springs. You know, this is a really fun way to be a volunteer. Of course, unless it's raining and you're in the water and it's cold, but you know, it's fun. These people love kayaking. So we do that, and I teach classes. I essentially took my college level class and turned it into a series of lectures. We called the Springs Academy. And during COVID, we stopped the in-class lectures, but they're all on YouTube, so you can look them up if you want to get a whole course on springs ecology. You can get it off of YouTube now. And I've been writing. You know, some of you have seen my op-eds in the Gainesville Sun for many, many years, and that I published those. That's one of the books, Death by 1,000 Cuts. Those are just op-eds out of the Gainesville Sun and some out of Orlando Sentinel and Jacksonville Times Union. So that's, you know, that's a old hash, putting things up, but I don't want to lose them. They're all in one place now, and you'll never find them if you try to find them on the internet. So they're all in one book, and it's the cheapest book up there. It's $10. But more importantly, even than these books, was the first thing I did when I started the Springs Institute. I was an ecological consultant. I was getting hired more and more to work on springs issues while I was still in consulting. And I studied Wekiva Springs, Rock Springs, Alexander Springs, Juniper Springs, Silver Springs, Rainbow Springs, DeLeon Springs, Madison Blue. I mean, I studied springs all over the place for the state. I was their expert on springs for a number of years until I was thoroughly convinced that these springs were all in trouble. They all had problems. They were all having flow reductions. On long-term average, flow was going down in all these springs, and they were being polluted by the way we're living on the land and how we're being careless with fertilizer, especially, and with septic tanks, especially. Those two things, human wastewater, animal wastewater, and fertilizer are polluting our springs. And so I started writing restoration plans for springs. And the first one I wrote was the McCullough Springs Restoration Plan. I was actually hired by the state of Florida. Their last hurrah, they had the Florida Springs Initiative at that time. And the last contracts they gave were to write, there were three, one to do a restoration plan for McCullough Springs, one to do one for Rainbow Springs, and one to do one for Silver Springs, or Ichtuckney Springs. And I got the contract to do the one for McCullough Springs. It was a 3-year contract. And I was leading the Wakulla Springs Working Group, which is a group of all the citizens over there with the city and with the county and with the state and with the public to study Wakulla. And so I got pretty far through that contract in the first year and had a draft restoration plan that I didn't have to turn in until the third year. And our new governor at that time, stopped the whole program, pulled all the contracts, all the projects stopped on Springs at that time. And I said, well, I'm gonna start the Springs Institute and do it myself, darn it. And so that's what I did. So I produced this first one. The next one I did was the Santa Fe restoration plan in 2012. And these are executive summaries. They're all in our office in High Springs, the North Florida Springs Environmental Center. So you can just walk in there and take copies of these for free. But there's a full report behind every one of these where we pull together all the existing data into a report. And the reports are between 120 and 200 pages long. You know, they're detailed reports of, at the time that they were written, of the most current information about each of these springs and what needed to be done to correct the pollution and the depletion that we were seeing. Silver Springs was the next one. This is a good picture here. Glass bottom boat and an alligator swimming right in the front. Of course, there's a lot of alligators there. Hitchtuckney was one of the early ones we did. Volusia Blue, Lower Swanee River, Middle Swanee River, Rainbow Springs, Wekiva. I finally got tired of writing all these things, so I wrote one report for all the springs called the Florida Springs Conservation Plan. And this is once again the executive summary that's available. And I'm continuing to write things like this. We're doing a report right now on the Swanee River. We did a health assessment on the Swanee River with a small grant from the Protect Florida Springs license tag grants. And so I'm working on that report right now. We're doing another study at Rainbow, doing a health assessment there with a tag grant. And then we did a major study on the Santa Fe River Springs, much more than was in the restoration plan. We went out and collected 2 more years of data, updated everything on it, and wrote a blueprint for restoration of the Santa Fe River Springs. And that was a generous donation or grant from a foundation for $500,000. So that was a really big deal for us because we're a pretty small operation. So the first book I wrote was Silent Springs, and it's the overview really, and this was published in 2015. It's you know, the book Silent Spring. Anybody remember that book? Rachel Carson. This is really sort of a tribute to her and a play on words. But Silent Springs refers to the fact that our springs are losing their flow, and you used to be able to actually hear the boil at Hitchtuckney Head Spring when you were 300 feet away, is what the old timers tell you. You could hear it bubbling, and you can't hear it anymore. And so it's about a brief history of springs, a brief ecology of the springs, and then all the issues that were going on with springs in terms of things that were, the state still is putting about $50 million a year into springs restoration. But unfortunately, the money's being spent rather carelessly with no follow-up, with no monitoring to see how the springs are doing. And so we're the only ones really doing that. And the money's, unfortunately, I don't know where it's going, but it's not helping the springs, which is just tragic. It's tragic. That means it's going into somebody's pockets. But some good things are coming out of it. Lake City replaced their spray field with a wetland, a recharge wetland, and that's a beautiful system. If you haven't seen it, it's not open to the public, but occasionally Audubon has field trips out there. And that turned out really well. And there's High Springs is going to convert their spray field to a wetland with more tag money, and I mean with Springs money. So there's some good things, but a lot of they're just not doing things the way they should. And this book sort of really lays that out. The next book, well, I told you about A Death by 1,000 Cuts. And my newest book is called Saving Florida Springs. I decided I needed a little book that legislators could actually read and not be afraid of it. So it's real narrow. It's got a lot of pictures in it. I got to try to get a picture on at least every other page. And there's really a simple prescription for Springs health. There really is. And that's what this book's about. We just need to stop doing, we have good laws in Florida. There were really some great laws. They were famous in the world in terms of our water management districts and our water laws, our minimum flows and levels laws and things like that, but they're not being enforced because of state government is having to look the other way. And why is state government looking the other way? Well, there's money in politics, and there's a lot of money in politics, and it's basically a large part of our legislators is paid to vote a certain way, and the laws now are written by lobbyists. You know, they're not being written by the legislators or the public, and a lot of things don't consider the public interest. And so, you know, that's just a fact of life. I guess I feel like I grew up in my 70s or my 60s to find out that the world really was more corrupt than I thought it was. But I was at a Springs conference the last 3 days, and one of our representatives from the House was there speaking last night at the banquet, and she, Anna Escamante, and she spells it out exactly the way it is. And she's in trouble, even she's a Democrat, she's in trouble even for she will not take money from sugar or from the other big lobbying groups, you know, because she don't want to be influenced by it, and she's going to suffer the consequences, but she just speaks it the way it is. She's on the inside. And so I've seen a lot of that. I've tried to help write the laws. One of the members on the panel yesterday morning that I was with is David Simmons, a senator from Orlando. He put in 14 years in the Florida legislature. Brilliant man, lawyer, and he helped write the Florida Springs and Aquifer Protection Act in 2016. And we were really excited about that. We worked with him for a number of years. But the final act was actually written by lobbyists at the King Ranch. And we weren't invited. Nobody was invited except the lobbyists and the legislators. But he felt very possessive of that act. He put a lot of effort in getting it started and following through with it. And he was convinced that it was going to solve the problems. And I just heard him, I recorded him on my camera yesterday saying, what we meant was no more of harm to our springs. And the law is explicit about that. He said they're not doing that. They're not enforcing the law. And this is a former senator, and he's writing letters to the governor saying that this is not being done right, you know, in the enactment of that law. It took him 6 years even to prepare a rule based on that law. And they developed plans for restoration of our springs, and we challenged them in court, and they don't come anywhere close to solving the problems. And here's a senator who was, you know, a Republican senator, but very willing to speak, saying those things. So this book is pretty sweet, okay? I don't call anybody by bad names, I don't think. But it spells it out, and it says what our legislators need to do. And we need to put a cap on groundwater use, and we need to put a price on water. So, you know, we're giving water to Nestle and all the other bottlers and Gainesville and all these places for free, nothing, no cost, you know, a permit fee. You know, enough for a ticket to Disney World is enough to buy a permit for 1 billion gallons of water a year. That's what Nestle got. And they sell the water for almost $2 a gallon. You figure it out, you know, who's making money here. But anyway, it's possible to fix it. It doesn't have to be on the backs of taxpayers. There needs to be a fee on water and a fee on nitrogen and a cap on both of those things, and we can solve the problem. So you don't have to get the book. That's the bottom line. But it's interesting. There's some nice pictures by John Moran. The last book, I met this lady, Marion Rizzo, down at Silver Springs, and she was a writer for the Cal Star Banner for many years, and she had written numerous articles about the people that work there at Silver Springs, the boat captains. These people have been doing boat captaining there for 40, 50 years, some of them. And the people that ran the Silver Springs attraction, you know, it was an attraction until 2013. The state finally kicked Palace Entertainment out of there. And Silver Springs used to get 1 million visitors a year. Before Disney, it was the place to go in Florida. It was the #1 tourist attraction. And it went way down during the time that Palace had it. And finally the state owned it, and they decided to end the lease and turn it into a state park. So it's all a state park now. It's getting better and better. There's a museum there that has been there for quite some time. It's just one of the best museums around. I mean, it's It's not much bigger than the Matheson Center, but it's just packed with neat things. And there's the attraction itself. You can still go on the glass bottom boats, and since it's raining a lot, we got a lot of flow and silver. So I highly encourage you to go there. So I think I've talked about the book. Have I gone on my time?
You've got time, but I think I'd like to take some time to finish.
Definitely. I am done talking. I would love to take some questions. Yeah. So does anybody have any questions? In the back there first?
I think that probably already know the answer to this, but what do you think about taking down whatever it's called now, the Rodman Dam?
Rodman Dam, yeah. Yeah, no, we're closer than we've been in 50 years. You know, it's more than 50 years now. When I did my doctoral research on those fish in Silver Springs, the last sentence of my dissertation is, wouldn't it be an interesting experiment to take out the Rodman Dam? And that dissertation was published in 1980, which is 42 years ago. But we haven't taken it down. And Marjorie Carr, they named the Cross-Florida Greenway after Marjorie Carr. She fought tooth and toenail to stop the barge canal, which she did. She succeeded at that, but they never took the dam down. And they've never deauthorized, well, the canal was deauthorized in 1992, but you know, so no, it's still there. And so there is a woman, Margaret Spontak is her name, who has pulled together 60 organizations, people from 60 different organizations working on politely convincing our governor and legislature to go ahead and remove the dam. And the dam is it's past its useful life. It's already been found to be a danger to human life and health because it could fail at any time. It's terribly corroded, and you know, it was built up more than 50 years ago. 67 was when it was closed. So I think we're close, but still no cigar, because we have an unfriendly administration right now, and for doing anything that might be thought to be environmental, even though it's not it should not be a political issue at all. The studies have been done. We found out it was much more valuable to have the river free flowing than it was with the dam on it in terms of the expenditure, the economic value of it. We found out that over 60 to 70% of the people, even in Putnam County, support removal of the dam, and it's Putnam County that's stopping it really politically. And all the other things are good. It's the only way we're ever going to restore Silver Springs. And I just recently wrote an op-ed that you may have seen. It's called Manna for Manatees. And if we open that, if we took that, open that dam, it's just partial restoration is what we need, not removal of the dam. The manatees would be in there. They'd be all over Silver River, and you'd have 500 or more manatees in Silver River, which would bring back 1 million people a year to Silver Springs State Park. So that's a long answer.
No, that's a great answer. It's interesting. This is a room full of primarily authors.
Mhm.
Some have been published traditionally, some have been published through small houses or self-published.
Mhm.
You're obviously a terrific writer, and you've written at least 4 books published, got another one in the way. Could you talk a little bit about getting your books published?
Well, it's not fair what I do. They're all self-published through the Springs Institute. So I don't consider that fair. In other words, I've never gone through the University Press of Florida. I've certainly published things in journals that had a lot of peer review in them, but you know, I'm just trying to get the English right in these things, and I know my science is right, but they're not peer reviewed like they would be if you publish it. But the first book I wrote was called Treatment Wetlands, and that's a 900-page book that was published by Lewis Publishers. So I have been through a publisher before, and it's, you know, they sell your book for a little while and then it's all over. And I don't think you need to do that. Nowadays, you can self-publish so easily. You can make, I mean, some of my books are hardbound, a couple of them. And well, one of them is actually published by a professional publisher, that's Silver Springs book. But Silent Springs, I got it hardbound by Alta Press here. And you can make a really nice book by self-publishing now. And you probably won't ever make any money off of it, but that's not why I wrote these books. I wrote them to pass on knowledge, and to, if we make any money at all, it'll go to the Florida Springs Institute. So, yeah, so I just encourage you to have your spouse review your writing very carefully. And luckily my wife is an author too, and she hates it, but she's just tough on me on the reviews. She makes sure I take out all the trash. Yes, in the back? Yeah.
So everybody, every time water says, what is that connection that says between Florida Springs and what is the water?
What's the connection? Well, it's a hydrologic cycle. They're both getting water from the Gulf of Mexico. You know, the only reason we have springs here is because we're a peninsula. We're like an island in the ocean. We're at a latitude where everywhere in the world that's at this latitude, except Florida, is a desert. And the reason we're not a desert is because we're only a little over 100 miles wide, 150 miles wide. We're an island. And when Florida was 100 miles wider back in the Pleistocene, it was dry as Africa. And that's when we had mastodons and camels and sloths and things running around Florida. It was a dry, cold time. And of course, that was during the ice ages too. But it was dry because the continent was so much bigger. And now with sea level rise, the continent's getting smaller. I don't know if anybody's been able to measure it yet, but we're getting narrower. And so that means we're more of an island. We're going to get more rain, I believe, just through this sea level rise and climate change effect. But that doesn't mean we'll get rain every year. But so the Everglades, they get 50 inches of rain a year. We get about 52 inches of rain a year. Tallahassee gets about 60 inches of rain a year. We're just a water-rich state in terms of, and that's because the Gulf of Mexico is so close. But there are parts of the state that don't get that much, and there's years when we don't get anywhere close to that. Some years, in like 2012, we get down in about 30 or 40 inches of rain, and our evaporation is that high. In other words, Florida has a really neat water balance. There's about, I think it's 160 billion gallons a day of water on average coming into Florida from rainfall and from river flow from Georgia and Alabama. And but we're spending 120 billion gallons a day on evaporation. But that's why we're a green state. That's why we have the land of flowers here. That's why, you know, we were named the land of flowers by the Spaniards. It's because we have this water to evaporate. And if you're in a desert, you don't have the green vegetation the way we do, except when it rains. So that's the only connection hydrologically. The Florida aquifer is under the Everglades, but it's thousands of feet down. And there are other aquifers above it. The Biscayne aquifer is, and there's limestone right at the surface, but it's not the Florida aquifer limestone. It's younger limestone. Sir?
Can you speak to the northern end and the western end of that massive sort of wetland, sort of swamps and so on, in Georgia, all the way up to like
Well, that gets out of the Florida aquifer. The Florida aquifer is estimated at 100,000 square miles and includes, it's under all of Florida. And actually, the limestone extends out in the Gulf of Mexico over 100 miles. It's called the Florida Platform out in the ocean. But it goes north. Florida aquifer is about a third of Georgia is underlain by the Florida aquifer, and they extract water from it. And that's in the coastal part, Brunswick and inland, not quite to Macon. At the fall line, you're getting off into other aquifers up in the Piedmont. And the aquifer goes all the way up to South Carolina. I worked up there, and they actually pump out of wells that go into the Florida aquifer in the southern part of South Carolina. There were springs up there. There's historic springs all through Georgia, but not nearly as many as we have. And then it goes into Alabama and Mississippi. But it doesn't go into Tennessee, Kentucky, and it doesn't go above the fall line anywhere. The Florida aquifer is this giant mass of limestone that was laid down during a 10 or 20 million years. I think the Oligocene period, and it was a shallow tropical sea, and it was just carbonate from dying marine organisms settling over hundreds of millions, or not hundreds, tens of millions of years to form several thousand feet of limestone. And it's interconnected. So when actually, theoretically, when they pump water in the coastal plain of South Carolina from the Florida aquifer, that affects water levels down here, theoretically. Because every well has a cone of depression around it. A well draws water out of the aquifer, and that pulls the water level down in the aquifer, the pressure down. And so they call it a cone of depression. And so that cone is a hyperbola that's described by a hyperbola. And if you remember algebra or whatever it was, the hyperbola extends into infinity. I mean, it goes until it gets to the edge of whatever it is, in this case, the Florida aquifer. So if you got 900,000 wells in Florida and all these overlapping cones of depression, what you see is there's just these regional declines in the aquifer levels that are pretty easy to describe, and they've been mapped. I've mapped them, and that's the aquifer is down 40 to 60 feet up at Jacksonville, the Florida aquifer. Down in Tampa, it's down even more than that. Polk County, it's down, and even under Gainesville, it's down. There's a cone of depression around our well field that extends several hundred square miles of a cone of depression that is changing flow directions to the Santa Fe River. So wherever there's a big pumping source and not much recharge, you get a big drop in the aquifer levels. Well, they are, the Florida is connected to these other aquifers. There are some confining layers in the Florida aquifer. So parts of it are not connected, upper parts and lower parts. They're not, there's a confining layer, and most of those confining layers are discontinuous, which means they are connected somewhere else. So water can move between the upper Florida and the lower Florida in some places. Gainesville dumps half its wastewater down a well into the deep Florida aquifer, the freshwater aquifer. They got a permit to do that a long time ago when I worked at CH Dillon Hill, and they're still doing it. And I would love to convince them, if anybody from GRU is here, I've talked to them about this in the past, because I used to work for them as a consultant. I would love to convince them to build a big wetland on the west side of town and recharge the rest of our wastewater into another wetland and put the well field over there, so we weren't drawing down the water going to the Santa Fe. But I haven't gotten there yet. There's a 4,000 acre development going in down on Parker Road now. I mean, you may have seen that in the paper. 4,000 acres, that's a lot more houses, a lot more people.
Yeah, I mean, that's a big part of the problem. More and more people are moving to Florida. I mean,
Yeah.
last year, over 10,000 people moved to the greater Gainesville area.
Yeah, it's 1,000.
Whether we want them or not, they're coming. What is going to happen?
Well, it's about 1,000 people a day. You know, the water use by individuals is almost trivial out of the Florida aquifer. The Florida aquifer gets about 10, in Florida, it gets about 10 billion gallons a day of water. And if at 100 gallons per day per times 20 million people, is that 2 billion gallons a day? Yeah, it's 2 billion gallons a day. So, but we can deal with that. Well, we shouldn't be using the Florida aquifer for everything. We shouldn't be using it for watering our plants. We should not be using it for landscape irrigation. We should not be using it for crop irrigation either. We're extending our agriculture into the worst lands that cannot be used without polluting the aquifer. The karst areas around the Swanee River are a terrible place for agriculture because they pollute and deplete the aquifer by doing that. So the book talks about all those things. It talks about using rainwater more effectively, putting cisterns on all our houses. Why not have cisterns?
We used to.
We used to in the old days, and they still do in the islands, and getting our drinking water that way. And then if we're going to irrigate outside, just do it with rainwater. And rain does it very freely most of the time. And having a cistern or a rain barrel, you could then irrigate the rest of the time. And then just not be dependent on plants. We have a program we're trying to develop called Springs Friendly Yards. And that's different from Florida Friendly Yards, where they tell you to irrigate and they tell you to fertilize. We say no fertilizer, no groundwater for irrigation. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know anything about the comparison of the amount of water taken from the Florida aquifer for printing books and
Yeah, I'm sure there's some effect, but it'd be negligible. It'd be negligible. I mean, I don't know anybody that's actually figured out what the water footprint was of book printing. I'm sorry, I do not have a number for you. But obviously, almost everything we do uses water. So what I suggest in here is that industrial facilities that need water, they build a reservoir and trap rain and use the rain, essentially reuse it. It's going to ultimately be discharged to the sea. And so you don't want to take all the fresh water away from the oceans either. In fact, I think that's what's happening in Indian River Lagoon, is the freshwater inflows have been cut down enough that you're getting algae growing, the planktonic algae growing that's shading out the eelgrass. And that's why the manatees are dying in the Indian River Lagoon. And that's what's so neat, what happened just at Crystal River. They planted the plants, but they've been doing that for years, and they never took until we had the last 4 years have been high rainfall years. And so it means all our springs are flowing more right now than they have for a long time. And, but that doesn't last forever. So you can't, just correcting the pollution doesn't help if you don't correct the hydrology too, the water, the amount of water that's coming into the system. Yes.
So, more trivial question, but do you have a favorite spring?
That's like having a favorite child. I consider all the springs my children, but no, of course I love Silver. I've been going there the longest. I went there for the first time with my grandparents in 1953. That's like in the Stone Age for you young folks. Yeah, no, I love them all, and I'm fearful that there won't be any healthy springs left for my grandchildren. I have grandchildren. I took my kids to the springs. We always went to Post Springs, and Post Springs used to be clear and blue, and it's not anymore. It's green or brown all the time now, and that's a human impact. That's not natural. And more and more of the springs have algae in them. But I tell you, the Ichtucknee is sure nice. I went out there with my son and my grandchildren last weekend. It's just really nice, and Silver's nice, and Rainbow's nice, but they're being loved to death too. The other thing that is affecting our springs is recreation, and that's negatively impacting the springs to a certain extent. So I deal with that in here too. Yes. Oh, well, let me try somebody else. Yes, sir. Blue shirt, the spring shirt.
I haven't read your book yet. About what to do about this, but the political battles over the springs and clean water in Florida for a long time, so it was discouraging to me to think that I could write a letter to the governor and kind of swing. How do you see this coming around in the next 10 years? We're going to hit a point where an irreversible situation. Are we kind of heading back to the direction that somebody's got to make a stand?
Yeah, I'm a realist and sometimes called a pessimist because realistically, with the current political climate we have, we're not going to make the tough decisions. They're not tough things economically, but they're tough decisions because they affect people's pocketbooks that have very deep pocketbooks. In fact, the pollution of our springs and the depletion of the springs can be attributed, 90% of those things can be attributed to less than 10% of the individuals in the state. In other words, there's about 30,000 large permits that are over 100,000 gallons a day each. So people have these permits that are enough water for 1,000 people. They have them personally, and they make money by having them. They are bottling plants, or they're watermelon fields, or they're some commercial use of the water. These are all for-profit organizations. So there's really only about, by impacting the profit of about 30,000 people, we could correct the problem for 20 million people. It sounds like it ought to be easy, but unfortunately, that's the 30,000 deepest pockets in Florida. So money really speaks, and until we have a different incentive for our government, I'm not very optimistic that things are going to get better. So I'm sorry.
It seems like this has been presented to our legislators, our governors over the years, that they have eyes that can see what's happening with the springs and everything, and sort of comprehension. They wouldn't see the children, grandchildren, and say, that's something about this.
Yeah. Well, I guess I didn't finish what I wanted to say, and that is, I'm very optimistic the springs will recover someday. This is not reversible. I mean, this is not irreversible. This is reversible. In other words, just by having wet years the last 4 years, we're seeing higher flows in the springs. And when the spring flows are higher, a lot of the algae washes out of the springs. It basically flushes the toilet, and they look better and they're healthier. Flow is the key physical parameter for a healthy spring. And so just nature can do that, but you can't rely on nature to be wet every year. We don't know when it's going to be dry again, and it will be, I'm sure. So springs will recover, if we like it or not, when we stop all these extractive industries that we're doing. And that may be beyond our lifespan. It may be, or it may not be. It could change just by changing government. It could change. And so we were always trying to encourage people to vote for the environment, not vote for some narrow policy, but vote for the environment. And the people of Florida did vote for the environment back in 2014, was it? The amendment number 1, the Land and Water Legacy Amendment. 75% of the people in the state, it was a clear thing. There was no good campaign against it, calling it evil and stuff like this. And 75% of the people in Florida voted for that amendment. And then the legislature immediately ignored it. And they've been sued ever since, and you can't stop them from taking that money and spending it on other things. So the government has to change for this to change. I am realistic about that.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. That was a fascinating talk, and I believe you have books for sale.
I do.
If anybody's interested and wants to learn more, because we can all learn a lot.
Thank you.
We're going to take another 15-minute break. We'll start again at exactly 3 o'clock with our next speakers. I'm the speaker coordinator for the Sunshine State Book Festival, and I would like to introduce our next 2 speakers. Robert and Patience Mason are both successful authors. Robert Mason has been flying planes since high school. After he joined the Army, he became a helicopter pilot and went to Vietnam with the 1st Cavalry Division, where he spent a year flying more than 1,000 missions. When he left the military, he wrote Chicken Hawk about his time in Vietnam. It's been described as the best book to come out of Vietnam. Chicken Hawk became a bestseller that sold over 500,000 copies. Following the book, he wrote Weapon, which was made into a film called Solo. Subsequently, he wrote Solo, and a second memoir, Chicken Hawk Back in the World. After her husband's book, Chicken Hawk, came out, Patience Mason, our second speaker, they're going to both speak during this time period, became interested in the after effects of war and wrote her own book, Recovering from the War, a guide for all veterans and family members and therapists. It has been described as the book every veteran will want to give their spouse, and every spouse will want to give their veteran. She also writes books for children and the newsletter, The Post-Traumatic Gazette. We're going to start with Bob, and then Patience will join later. So please give him a warm welcome, Robert Patience.
My toy helicopter.
Yeah.
Never without it. I sleep with it. So I wanted to start by saying I just turned 80 a couple of weeks ago, so I'm now officially an octogenarian. I didn't get but where I am by healthy living, I'll guarantee that. But at any rate, as you get to this age, for me at least, this concept of dying comes up. And I came up with a very satisfying saying about what to expect. And what I think about it is, I'd like to die like my grandfather, who died peacefully in his sleep, not screaming like the other passengers in his car. Thanks for the. Thank you, Christina. I always wanted to be a pilot. The time I was a kid, I was a country kid, I lived on a farm, and a guy across the street was an airplane mechanic. And he took me up to the airport when I was like 12 and showed me the inside of a Piper Cub and the switches and stuff, and cranked the motor up. And I immediately loved everything about it. The noise, the engine was noisy, the airplane vibrated, and I loved all of that. I thought this is just great. It wasn't until a few years later, when we moved into town, that I decided I really wanted to take flying lessons. So I had like 3 jobs I worked as a bag boy at a grocery store. I worked at a camera shop selling cameras. And I worked out to the airport operating the radio and washing airplanes to finance my pilot training. It started out informally. A friend of mine who was also getting pilot training, I was 17 at the time, by the way, was taking me up in the plane with him if I would pay for the gas. And he was showing me how to land it. And these planes were small plane with single engine with 2 seats, fore and aft. You sat one behind the other. So when I got to my 3rd hour of flying with my friend, he said, you should fly with my instructor pilot, see what he thinks. So I did. And the instructor pilot on my 4th hour soloed me, 4 hours total time in the aircraft. And so on my first solo flight away from the airport, I decided to fly down over my house in Delray Beach. And I had told my parents I was coming over in the airplane. So I wanted to circle the plane and wave at them and stuff. And so they were all out in the yard waving at me, mom and dad and my sister. And so I would just keep in mind, I was 17. I circled the house once, and then I cut the power abruptly, which causes the plane to backfire loudly. And then I didn't bring power back in again. So the plane goes, my mother's going, my God, what happened? What happened? He's going to crash. And I kept going. I spiraled down and down, never turned the engine back on, flew over the trees towards a lake nearby our house and leveled off over the lake so they never saw me come up. I flew low level back to the airport thinking, wasn't that hilarious? They were not amused. So then my dad would help me pay for airplane training by hiring me. My dad was a real estate broker. He would hire me to go out in the country and take pictures of property that he was selling. I remember one day I flew out to Sebring, Florida from West Palm Beach is where my airport was. And after I took some pictures, I would fly low level with the plane, hold the stick in my knees, put the camera out like this and take pictures. And on the way back, there's a straight shot of road that runs from Sebring, Florida, all the way to West Palm Beach, straight as an arrow. And if you're flying it, you can see 50 miles ahead. And there was no cars on the road except one car, a white Cadillac. And the Cadillac was barreling down the road, probably doing 80, 85 miles an hour. There was no other traffic. And I was following him going back to West Palm. And I thought, I wonder if he could see me if I came down lower in his blind side. In other words, if I kept my plane off to his blind side, would he ever see me? So I had nothing else to do. It's a long trip. So I come down, I'm able to keep up with this car, with the plane. I keep getting closer and closer and closer till I'm going over fences and stuff. I'm right beside the guy's car in his blind side. He still doesn't know I'm there. He's smoking a cigarette. So I said, oh, boy, he's got to see me. So I finally whip over behind him, about 10 feet behind his car. He still doesn't see me. It takes about 30 seconds. And suddenly he sees me in the rear mirror of the car, an airplane on his ass at 85 miles an hour. And the car starts to swerve all over the road as he panics. And I thought, oh my God, so I take off and get away. Again, it's just another 17-year-old flying experience. Then my next big mission to test my flying skills, I decided I wanted to bomb my hometown, Delray Beach, with toilet paper. Delray Beach is a coastal town, and a friend and I got a box of one gross of toilet paper, 144 rolls, and unrolled them so that they could, undo if you flew them out and jumped them out in the air. So we undid all the little rolls in the big case, took it up in an airplane, flew out over the ocean. I wanted to bomb the downtown municipal swimming pool area. So we flew up and down, and I would toss out a single toilet paper and watch it. It comes out immediately, a nice long stream, 150 feet, and it would drift. No, it didn't make it. Come back and we'd pick our course again, drop another one, target, got it. Out goes one case of toilet paper. It comes down 100 44 sheets of toilet paper, makes this cloud going towards Delray. It drifts over the municipal pool, over the power lines, everything. It touches it like Christmas. And it made the papers and everything. Delray bombed by toilet paper. So that was my flying experience before I got serious. I eventually got my private pilot's license as a civilian. Later, by the way, I asked an FAA examiner later, would they have arrested me for bombing Delray? He said, no, you get arrested if you drop something that would hurt somebody. You might have been arrested for littering. So it wasn't entirely illegal. So I had a chance to join the Army for the flight program. I was in Connecticut, listening to the radio in my truck, and I heard, high school graduates, do you want to fly helicopters or airplanes? Join the U.S. Army. So I went to New Haven, Connecticut, took a competitive test about helicopters and how they work, which I knew because I really loved helicopters already. And I passed the test, and they sent me to basic training, regular infantry training at Fort Dix, thanks. Fort Dix, New Jersey, where I went through infantry training, and then Fort Polk, Louisiana, where I went advanced infantry training, all the while waiting to go to the flight school in Texas. Eventually, I got to the flight school in Texas and got to fly as a trainer, a helicopter called a Hiller. And it's a small 3-place helicopter. And like I said, by the time I got there, I had a pilot's license. So I thought this was going to be pretty simple. How hard could it be? Have you ever watched a helicopter fly? They just sit there. They float over the ground like magic carpet. What's to do? So I got it the first time I get in the helicopter, the IP takes me out to a field, a big field. At one side of the field, there's a big tree. He says, okay, so I'm going to demonstrate how to hover this helicopter. We're going to point it at that tree, and we're going to stay over this spot where we are. And that's what we're trying to do. So he says, the stick on the side, that makes you go up and down. There's a throttle on the end of that stick that you turn to keep the RPM at the right RPM. Got to remember that. Then the stick in front of you that you move in any direction, move it in the direction you want the helicopter to go, and the helicopter will go that way. And then there's pedals out on the front that you turn, you push the pedals to point the helicopter where you want it to point. I said, you got that? I said, yeah, I got that. He said, okay, give it a shot. So I grabbed the sticks, the pedals, and he said, okay, you got it. So I'm hanging there, and for, a couple of seconds, it's doing just perfectly. And then all of a sudden it starts to rear up, like nose high and going backwards. So I push this stick forward, and then it noses forward really fast. And then I noticed that I'm twisting this way, and the guy saying, remember that tree out front? Yeah, okay, the tree. So anyway, by the time I'm reared like this and tilted and going crazy, the IP says, I got it. And he brings it back to a hover. And the idea was that you kept doing this until you got better. And he said, not bad, kid, you're a natural. I said, a natural? I couldn't, we almost crashed. He said, well, we'll just keep practicing in smaller fields. You'll eventually get it. So flight training and basic flight training in Fort Walters, Texas, this teaches how to hover the helicopter, how to fly, landing, takeoff, and getting in and out of tight LZs, landing zones, which is going to be the future for us when we got to Vietnam, getting into a cluttered spot on the ground, usually surrounded by trees. And in Vietnam, there'll be people in there shooting at me. But first we had to learn how to be able to clear the trees, get into the LZ, and then get back out again. And then part of the other training was, what does a helicopter do when the engine quits? The Army taught us to fly with the attitude that the engine will quit. So you better be ready for it. And the way helicopters behave when the engine quits is they glide, but they call it auto rotation in helicopters. And the deal is, as long as the blades are turning like this and the engine quits, and you push that stick down, the one on the side goes up and down, push it down all the way, it flattens the pitch in these blades, and they continue to windmill on the oncoming air. So the air keeps them going, and the pull of gravity down keeps them spinning. So it'll glide down from any altitude, comes down at a steep angle, but it's gliding, and it comes down at about 1,500 feet a minute. Then when you get close to the ground, so you're about here, and this is where I want to land, you start to flare the helicopter. The blades are still spinning. The blades actually kind of spin up at that point, and you let it settle down. This is slowing your forward speed down. And as soon as the tail rotor is just about that high, you pop that stick, that pitch on the side, you pop it to stop the vertical descent, and then you roll the helicopter over and set it on the ground, pulling all the pitch. And if you do it right, the helicopter might move a couple feet. So a helicopter is very safe when the engine quits, because you can glide, and if it's a space as big as the helicopter, you can put it in that space. I'll tell you more about this when I get to the Vietnam section of the talk. So we flew a trainer there at Fort Alabama, Rucker, Mother Rucker. At Fort Rucker, we flew a Sikorsky H-19 helicopter, which is an ancient helicopter. It was ancient at the time, but one good thing about it was underpowered. And I say that's a good thing because when you got in it, the first time I got in it and tried to fly it, I pulled it off the ground, and I'm moving this cyclic and stuff and hovering, which I had learned to do in Texas. And the helicopter just settled right back out of the ground, out of the sky, and sat down on the ground again. And the IP said, you can't move the cyclic or anything else because it'll dump the air underneath the rotors and you'll sink. So that helicopter taught us to be very, very gentle on the controls, and which was can be very valuable later in Vietnam, because in Vietnam, the helicopters are always overloaded, and we had to fly very carefully to keep them in the air with a heavy troop load. So during the training at Rucker, the last helicopter we were introduced to was this helicopter, which was brand new at the time, the UH-1 Huey. And it has a turbine engine back here. What makes it novel at the time, it was one of the first helicopters with a turbine engine. A turbine engine is like a jet engine with a little propeller in the back with a gear shaft that turns the main rotor. So it's a jet-powered helicopter, which means that it was much lighter. The engine only weighs 400 pounds in this helicopter. And a helicopter weighs a total of 5,000 pounds and can lift 4,500 pounds, almost its whole weight. It had a capacity, a crew of 4, pilot, co-pilot, gunner, and crew chief. Each of those were gunners. So, and 8 grunts. So 12 people altogether would fly in this machine, depending upon the density altitude, they call it. Density altitude is a measure of how dense the air is and how much load you can carry. In other words, if you're high in the mountains, you can't carry as much cargo. If you're down in the sea level, you can carry more. So we would calculate that and decide how many troops we could carry based on density altitude. So when I first got into the Huey at Rucker, the guy says, I think you're going to like this. But one of the differences was there's no vibration. It was a silent, kind of a jet whine. And when I pulled up the collective, this is called the collective, it kind of fell up. It just goes, I want to fly, it says. It was beautiful. It just wants to fly. It's got a lot of power. It wants to fly. So that was the ship that I was being trained for would be flying in Vietnam. So from Fort Rucker, Alabama, I went to a short stopover in Washington, D.C., flying for a 3rd transportation company. But I knew, and they knew, it was only be for 1 month. We actually stayed there for a month. We got an apartment and all that. Patience and I's first apartment together. And 1 month later, they said, your lease is canceled. You're going to be joining the 1st Cav Division. 1st Cav Division was formed up at sorry, thanks. Look, we're not for these guys. So formed up at Fort Benning, Georgia. And they had taken helicopter pilots from all over the Army inventory, brought them down to Fort Benning and formed up the 1st Cav Division. And we had a total of 400 Hueys. And we were going to be the world's first all-air assault infantry division. And we had 400 of these. We had another 100 or so of the Chinooks, which are the ones with the 2 big blades on them, and another 100 or so of observation choppers. And so I was assigned to these, and I was assigned to the 1st Cav Division, 229th Assault Helicopter Battalion, known as the Preachers. So we went over by boat, and on the boat way over, I met most of the guys I was going to serve with for the rest of my tour. We got to Vietnam. We took the boat, our helicopters, many of our helicopters were on that boat. We stripped off the coverings and stuff and flew them inland to a place called An Khê, which was a small village next to a river. And we were building a big camp, the biggest full division camp in Vietnam at the time. We were the first full division to go to Vietnam, 1965. So we lived in tents and we chopped down trees and other bullshit while we're getting ready to be put into action. And I remember our first assault as a helicopter company was flying a low-level assault into Happy Valley. Now these helicopters flew in flights of 4, one on either side of the lead helicopter, and then another one off the side of the 3rd helicopter. We tried to keep it as tight as possible. Now, flying helicopters in formation makes one nervous the first few times because you're flying next to another wing that's spinning. So you're coming in with a wing that's spinning, and you're kind of nervous about how close you get to the spinning wing. They don't do well when they hit. So we tended, the cab guys flew between 1 and 2 rotor diameters apart. And we'd close it up to tighter than that, depending on the size of the LZ. The object was to get all 4 of these ships into the LZ at the same time so we could cover each other. So deal was we took off, we're flying low level over Happy Valley. And the first thing that happens is the people in the villages on the way to our LZ are shooting at us and blasting out our windshields and stuff because we were low. We'd been taught we should come in high, but they didn't conductor to do that. So we got windshields shot out, got a couple guys wounded before we even got to the LZ. And when I got there, it was utter chaos. It was brand new to me, any of this air assault stuff. Everything moved really fast. We were cruising about 100 miles an hour, palm trees flying by us, people screaming on the radios, people, I'm taking hits and stuff like that. And when I got back to camp, I was saying, I may never live through this. It was too much excitement. It's like, and our door gunners are blasting away, it's really a lot of excitement going on. We did that, and the assaults got more and more frequent and more dangerous as we fought the enemy known as the Viet Cong in Vietnam. Some of the things that I did in my helicopter that I describe in my book. My book has been described as you could actually learn to fly a helicopter if you read my book. That's an exaggeration, but one of the things that happened to me one day, we picked up a load of rocket tubes for the other guys. There was a kind of helicopter that shot just rockets. And so we were to carry a bunch of rocket tubes to this LZ where they were. And they loaded it up and it came to about 3,000 pounds of, remember it can carry 4,500 pounds if the density altitude is correct. Well, it wasn't. It loaded me up in plate coup and we tried to take off in a hover and it couldn't get off the ground. So there's a way of taking off a helicopter if you can't hover. And it's called a ground roll. So you pull as much weight you can, make it as light as possible, and you kind of skid along the ground. We skidded along the ground. It's a steel runway, bounce, 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 and pretty soon kind of gets in the air, staggers into the air, and then fly back around. Hopefully, you're hoping that I'll burn enough fuel so that by the time I get to the LZ where I'm supposed to land, I'll be able to land onto the ground without crashing. So we come back around, we fly about 20 miles to the place where I'm supposed to drop these rocket tubes. They stick out both sides of the helicopter. At this LZ, it's occupied, and there's a ground guide on the ground. He's got his hands off like this where I'm supposed to land. And I noticed that there's concertina wire around the camp, 2 rows of it, one right near it, another row beyond it. And the guy wants me to land between them. I can't question why that is. That's just what he wanted. He's got his hands up like this. So I'm coming in, trying to not crash because I know I can't still hover. So I come in about 6 feet off the ground, and guys that further away are waving like this, and I hear on the radio, don't land there. What? Don't land there. That's a minefield. And so I'm coming in with my heavy load that I can't hover, and it's sinking. I pull all the pitch that I had, all the power that I had, and the helicopter, God bless it, sank really close to the ground, like a foot, and just hung there. And all the lights and all the RPM warning gauges were beeping. The RPM was low, and it was settling down into the grass, and it would pick up a little bit and settle. And the guy is saying, you can't land there. You got to leave. And I said, I can't. I couldn't leave because I was surrounded by a perimeter of wire that I couldn't get high enough to get out of there. So I tried several times to milk it up, like let it go down as far as it go, and then bring in the RPM as best I could, pull it up, and it would get like 2 or 3 feet in the air and sink back down again. Just wouldn't get high enough. My co-pilot, more experienced pilot than I, he said, try a right pedal turn. I said, well, what would that do? He said, well, a right pedal turn, you don't use the tail rotor. The tail rotor, by the way, takes 110 horsepower out of the main engine. There's a drive shaft here. It's power for the main engine, turns the tail rotor. So if you use the tail rotor, if you're turning against the torque, the helicopter, if it weren't for the tail rotor, the helicopter would turn. This is the way the rotor goes. And if there was no tail rotor, the fuselage would go the opposite direction. So you'd be going like this, around and around and around, underneath the rotor. So they put the tail rotor there to keep it straight. So if you're in a left-hand turn, you need to put power there to keep it from turning. But in a right-hand turn, you don't use any power. And the helicopter wants to turn. That's very bad if it happens in flight. So you turn this way, it doesn't use any power in the tail rotor. So you gain 110 horsepower. So try a right pedal turn. So I move then towards the fence. Let's say this is the fence. Sideways like this. I get close to it, and then I do my right pedal turn and come over and keep it, let it turn like this and come out on the other side like that. Because of that tip. So I thought that was really great. And so he said, so did you learn something? I said, you mean like the right pedal turn? He said, no, never trust a grunt. He's the guy who brought you in here, remember? So LZ Albany was a famous battle waged by the North Vietnamese regulars. We had been fighting up to then VC, the Viet Cong, who were like the peasant army, and the North Vietnamese regulars wore uniforms, carried, the real deal. And they made a stand there, LZ Albany and LZ X-ray. I was involved in that mission. It was probably the biggest air assault in Vietnam at the time. And after LZ X-ray was taken, the troops moved to LZ Albany, where they were immediately surrounded by the enemy and lost over 400 men. And they were fighting in really tall elephant grass, and they're completely surrounded. And we had to get them out of there, even the wounded and the dead. So I was picked. I was one of 3 Hueys who volunteered to go in at night into LZ Albany, which was surrounded, and not use any landing lights or anything like that to make a target, and land in Albany and and gather the wounded guys. So that's what we did. But I have to say, it was one of the spookiest landings I'd ever made because we didn't have a landing light. And as we approached Albany in complete darkness, there was no moon. Our grunt got up with a little red flashlight, blinked the flashlight so you could see where we were supposed to go. But the thing is, with a flashlight, if you focus on the flashlight and it's the only point of reference you've got, the flashlight starts to move all over the place. But it's not the flashlight that's moving. It's you that are moving all over the place. It's really hard to do that. So I set up a rate of descent, kept it as best I could, wandering around, and just kept coming down and down and down and down until clunk, hit the ground. It was a big surprise to me. And then suddenly grunts were scurrying around with red flashlights, loading wounded guys on board. And then as we started to get light, get out of there, the VC who had been, or the North Vietnamese regulars had been on the far side of the LZ, opened fire on us with tracers and stuff. So it was like raindrops of tracers trying to get us leaving. So we managed and got out. I took one hit out of the whole thing at Albany, but it was one of my more exciting landings at night. About a month later in Happy Valley, remember I was talking about auto rotations? A place called Happy Valley. I don't know how they got these names. They certainly were not happy. But at Happy Valley, two things happened. One of my best friends, we were making a landing to an LZ, a sandy LZ near the coast. And as we came in, I was on his tail, and a bullet came through his right triangle window here, shot him in the heart. As he died, he put down the pitch like he's supposed to do for auto rotation, crashed into the LZ, and his co-pilot jumped out with a rifle to take on the bad guys. So I was right behind him. So then when it came time to take off, we wanted to rescue the co-pilot at least, but we weren't allowed to because there was another flight coming right behind us. The North Vietnamese regulars had the place already prepped. They had guys behind brush and everything waiting for us to do this. So anyway, we took off. As I took off, I got about 100 feet in the air. I heard tick, 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 tick. I got hit on the right side, right about in here. Four bullets went into my engine compartment, but the ship kept on going. So I kept climbing up, following the lead ship. I got about 800 feet in the air, and the engine goes, pew! I'm gone. No more engine, Bob. So then that stick over here, push that stick down. My training is like etched into my brain. So I'm flying this way. The wind's coming from this way. I drop the pitch. Now I'm in auto rotation, coming down fast. I turn around into the wind, which is how everything that flies lands. Birds, airplanes, helicopters all land into the wind. And as luck would have it, ahead of me, after I rolled out, I called Mayday, Mayday. And I remember my ship, I'm landing. And there happened to be a skinny little clearing about 500 yards in front of me. It was so close, as a matter of fact, I had to do S-turns on the way down to lose altitude. Otherwise, I would have overshot. So I came down through that clearing. This very tense moment. The guy, my crew was in the ship, and they're like biting their nails and everything. So we come in, and same thing as I was showing you before. I flared the thing perfectly, landed in that little skinny LZ, and skidded about 6 feet. And then, which I got a big cheer from the crew. They all thought they were going to die, and we didn't. So I felt very good about that. So about this time, I'm leaving out quite a few things, obviously, the time element. About this time, I was transferred to Blue Stars, which is another aviation company further south, and they flew things differently. And I only mention a couple missions there. My favorite was probably the one where my friend Gerald Tyler and I went through a bunch of heavy fire to rescue a very important person at an LZ. All we got was, you got to get this guy out of here. You got to get this guy out of here from the grunts. I said, is it a hot LZ? No, it's not hot. They always lied. We can say it's hot, we won't come in. So, no, it's fine. So Jerry and I as soon as we got a short approach over the trees, we started getting shot at. I thought you said it was not a hot LZ anyway. So we come in with land. It was very, very difficult to land because it's like a vertical shaft. Landed down there, and we saw these guys coming out with somebody wrapped in a blanket. They threw the blanket on with another guy carrying it, and they sat back in the back. And then we took off again. And on takeoff, we're getting shot. As soon as we crossed the tree line, shots came through the windshield. And we got up, as soon as we cleared the area, my buddy Jerry looks back and he says, "You're not going to believe who we just saved." And I said, "What?" So I turned around and looked. We had just registered a canine soldier. I looked back and there's the soulful eyes of a police dog, badly wounded. He's looking at me. So we risked our lives to save the canine soldier. So this is my experience summary. And I came home at the end of 1 year and came back, and my first problems were that I couldn't sleep. I had a real hard time sleeping. I was also addicted to adrenaline. Somebody says I was like tight as a snake. So I had considered writing my story, first person, and in New York City, I finally got a job after I got out of the Army. I worked at making mirrors in New York City. While I was there, I volunteered to be interviewed by a guy who was doing a study on Vietnam pilots. And he said he wanted to write a book about my experiences. And I called him and said, "No, I'm going to write my own book about my experiences." So while I was there, one of my best friends happened to live in New York, was Martin Cruz Smith. He wrote Gorky Park and a whole bunch of other books. He's real famous for his Arkady Renko series. His agent was named Knox Berger, one of the primary agents in New York City. Bill invited me to lunch with Knox and wanted me to tell stories about some of the things I just told you. And Knox said, "Well, if you told that story," I said, "I would like to take what I've experienced and other guys' experience and write a novel." No. What you want to do is write down the stories just like you told me. It'd be a memoir. You do something with that. So, okay, I'll try that. So that's what I did. I started, quit that mirror business. We moved to Florida, out to High Springs. And I wrote myself a contract that I'd work every day from 9 till noon. I wanted to make it as easy as possible, otherwise I wouldn't do it. So working hours, okay, 9 to 12, I can handle that. 4 days a week, 1 day in town at the library getting research. So that's what I did. I sat there every day, did that. I sent the first part up to Knox Berger. He's the only agent I knew. And while he was taking it around to sell to people, I was like destitute. And this guy came over and said, "Bob, how would you like to make $30,000? I said, "What do I have to do?" He said, "I just have to be a lookout on a boat." "What kind of boat?" "Well, it's a sailing boat. We're going to be sailing marijuana up from the Caribbean to Gainesville, and you get 30 grand for it. Only take a couple of weeks." I said, "Okay." See, my adrenaline level was still high at this time. Adventures, okay, why not? So I went, while I was then on this mission to smuggle marijuana, Knox was trying to sell my book. When we came back, it was an unsuccessful mission because as soon as we came back with 4,000 pounds of marijuana in our boat, we were arrested by customs agencies, took us to jail. And so I was off on bond for a year. I was going to go to the Supreme Court. And during that year, the book was published. And I showed up on the Today Show about a week before I was supposed to report to the jail. Brian Gumble said, as part of the interview, Bob, I understand something important is going to be happening to you in the 3 or 4 days. I said, that's right, Brian, I'll be going to jail. So the book came out while I was in jail, and it was reviewed by every major newspaper in the country. All good reviews. And it became a New York Times bestseller while I was in jail. I could read about I was on, it was a terrible example of mixed emotions. Here I have a successful writer in jail. Yeah. Later, I read a book about being in jail, which is called Back in the World. So I thought I would just give it a quick example. I'm kind of running out of time. It's 37 minutes now. Talking about how I actually got the book published, because I understand there's quite a few writers here. Okay.
The room is full of writers.
The room is full of writers. Well, the first thing, it was luck, because I knew a really good agent and a really good writer who encouraged me to do this. And luckily, I was able to fulfill my part and write a pretty good story that Knox liked, and then he took it around and tried to sell it. Well, he was turned down 5 times. It took the 5th publisher bought it. Gerald Howard, pretty famous editor, bought it in Viking. It was his first hardback book. He bought it. See, the thing is, people don't really understand is the author is selling to an editor in a publishing house. And there's lots of editors and lots of publishing houses. Your job is to try to find the one guy that likes your book. You don't know where he is. So luckily at Viking, Gerald Howard he read the manuscript, he'd been wanting to do a Vietnam book. And that's why he bought it. I only had the first part, so they paid me $2,500 and for the first third, and $2,500 for the second, third, et cetera, until I got $7,500 total advance. And that's how I lucked into it, basically. Had I not known Knox Berger, I don't know what would happen, really. So, does patients want to? Yeah, we're out of time, patient. Okay. Yeah. Any questions while I'm waiting? Yes, ma'am.
400 how many came back or how many survived?
How many Hueys? 5,000 Hueys were lost. Yeah. Oh yeah, no problem. Pilots too, we lost over 5,000 pilots, and our motto was, don't worry if you get shot down and killed, there's always another pilot to take your place. 2 years at a minimum security prison up on the Panhandle, Eglin Air Force Base. Operated the clothing room. And I wasn't reformed. Unreformed.
Do you have a felon record, and did you change that in order to get any of the things that, felons are denied even after they serve their time?
I was on probation, after I served 2 years, and then there's like 4 more years of you're on probation, and record's clear. The only thing I'm not allowed as an ex-federal felon is to own a gun. I can vote and all the rest of it.
Did you keep a journal or did you?
Yeah.
write the book off memory?
That I should have mentioned that. I wrote patients a letter every day, which became my journal. And one day when I was getting ready to write the book, I'd taken all these letters I had written and thrown them out on the street when we moved. And then
I went out and said, those are my fucking letters, and you are not throwing them out.
Yes, dear. So
So then a few years later, he says to me, Patience, do you have those letters? I
So I
wasn't
used
too
up-
mean.
The letters I used to get the chronological events in order, because everything kind of went together. But the letters allowed me to spell out the chronology. The patience, you've only got 3 minutes.
No, I'm going to talk until quarter of.
Okay, quarter.
Yeah, and then if there's any questions, they can ask. So when Bob got out, we went up to UCI to talk to a group of veterans up there, Union Correctional Institute. And when we were done, the vets all said to me, "Oh, I wish you could talk to my wife." And I had tried to write a memoir too, but I couldn't. Every time I started writing about stuff, I started crying because I missed him so much when he was over there. And on the way back from UCI to High Springs, I realized I could talk to them. I could write a book. And I had, I made an outline. I was going to write a book so that they could look up their husband's MOS, like 11B, meaning a grunt, or, helicopter pilots, whatever your MOS was, and see what year it was really bad being that thing. Well, the book of MOSs is this thick. So I had to change my plan. One of the good things that happened was because most veterans of Vietnam love helicopter pilots who would come whenever they needed them. Most veterans loved me because I was still married to them. That wasn't very common after Vietnam for people to stick to their husbands. And, nobody wanted to hear about Vietnam. And I wanted to hear about Vietnam. So when people were happy to talk to me, and I wanted to know the details. There's a couple of guys here in my book, and they told me details. People used to ask me later, how'd you get people to tell you those things? Well, I was interested. That's how. And then, so I'm thinking about what the book's going to be like, and I'm a totally crazed codependent at the time. I just think Bob is my problem and I'm going to fix him, instead of the war is the problem and it's Bob's problem and I cannot fix it. So I didn't know any of that. So I saw this book. I'm a big bookaholic. It was called Days of Healing, Days of Joy. And it was for adult children of alcoholics. And I thought, oh, I'll get that because a lot of vets are alcoholics and, I can help their kids. So the first thing it says in adult children of alcoholics literature is adult children of alcoholics do not know what normal is. Well, adult wives of people with PTSD do not know what normal is. Is it normal to want to be hugged? I didn't know. I thought it was, but maybe not. So that really helped me. I got into an adult children of alcoholics group, and that turned my book from how to be a codependent lunatic into things that might help you get better. And the other thing that really helped was I have the kind of mind that puts things together. So, one of the symptoms of PTSD is efforts to avoid thoughts or feelings associated with a trauma. And at the time in the VA, if you were an alcoholic, that was considered willful misconduct and it had nothing to do with your war experiences. You were just a jerk. But I could see that probably the simplest way to avoid thoughts or feelings associated with a trauma was get drunk or get high or get laid or, watch TV, stuff like that. And, I'd been talking to a lot of people, so I was really beginning to feel like I understood war. And then Bob and I went to see Platoon. And when we came out, I said to him, "Oh, that was so horrible." And he just looked at me and he said, "It's worse when it's real." And that just went boom in my heart. Because I realized I cannot understand a single thing about this. I've never seen a dead person or smelled blood and shit. I don't know anything about it. And, it's one of the things, I also see all the symptoms as survival skills. So, hypervigilance, hyper alertness. Bob, I'm not going to stop for a few minutes, okay? Hypervigilance. It keeps you alive. Numbing keeps you alive and able to do your job. So all of the symptoms are survivor skills. And I wrote about that, and actually my book is sometimes called The Big Book of PTSD. And sometimes it's called the Bible of PTSD. Women tend to call it the Bible, alcoholics call it the Big Book. So anyhow, writing was, you know, he was doing the 9 to 12. So I was too ashamed not to do that because I'm really lazy. So I did 9 to 12 also. And I have a little thing out there about the tricks we learned, like stop in the middle of a sentence. And then when you get back the next day, you know where you're starting and you won't be sitting there wondering what to write. And I've got a handout out there if any of you want it. So I will stop now.
Let's get in front of them. Keep people happy. Thank you so much, both of you, for speaking for us. And this is for you.
Oh, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Let's have a big hand for it. We've got 10 minutes to the next speaker, but they'll be sitting at back of the table there.
Festival is Paul Ortiz. He is the director of the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program and professor of history at the University of Florida. In the 1980s, he served for 5 years in the 82nd Airborne Division and the 7th Special Forces in Latin America. He was awarded the U.S. Army Forces Humanitarian Service Medal for his meritorious actions there. He's written several books. I'll let him talk more about his books. I'll tell you a little bit about a few of them. Emancipation Betrayed, The Hidden History of Black Organizing and White Violence in Florida from Reconstruction to the Bloody Election of 1920. It's been described as an essential teaching of American history and a critical resource for understanding grassroots organizing today. His book, An African American and Latinx History of the United States, was described by Fortune magazine as one of the 10 books in American history that actually reflects the United States. Amazingly, and strangely, and sadly, his book has been banned, but this book has been banned. I'll let Paul tell you more about it. I hear there's nothing.
Thank you, Elsa, and thank you for another round of applause for organizing, this amazing event. Thank you. It's really cool to be back home. Most of the book talks I give and lectures, tend to be in other places, other states. So it's really cool to be here with so many great friends and colleagues. And, the book has been banned, yes, but as anyone can tell you, sometimes having one's book banned is an author's best friend because every time there's an article that runs that the book has been banned, I notice there's probably a bump in sales sometimes, which is unfortunate because on the other hand, it means in the last time there, yesterday morning, actually a colleague called me, actually Connie Lester, who directs the public history program at University of Central Florida. She texted me yesterday morning and said, "Oh, Paul, your book has been banned again." And there's a piece in HuffPost about it. But the time before the book had been banned, it was actually, one of my former students who's a history professor at Texas A&M University said that the day it was announced in her branch library, the book was actually pulled out of the library, but it wasn't burned. It was being held in, there's a term for it, it was being held pending further investigation of content. So the way things happen in this country sometimes is really odd. But one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today is kind of the content. There's a title for the talk, which is about resistance, anti-colonial histories, really from the colonial period to present. And so I want to try to cover that, but also because so many of us are writers or we're following what's happening in the publishing world. I wanted to give you some of my experience. I've been able to work with some great editors, including New York editors, Boston editors. I've been able to work with a lot of folks who also publish their own books. Some of you may be familiar, and I actually have some extra bookmarks here. Phil Owen Wright Sr. has a wonderful book out. I'll just pass out a few of these. And the reason I'm doing this is because this is a self-published book that he wrote. It's called Night Riders: An American Family in Peril in St. Augustine, Florida. And this is really a good time to think about the possibility of either self-publishing a book or publishing with a small regional and or local press. I would guarantee that this book, and sometimes people say, oh, well, if you self-publish or if you publish with a local press or regional press, you're just not going to sell this much. This book probably outsells most academic books, frankly. And the reason that Night Riders does so well, and I actually had the honor of being able to read the manuscript, work with Mr. Wright, offering him the experience I had as an editor. But the reason this book sells so well is really the key to getting your book out there and getting your book published and even getting a relationship with the press. And it doesn't matter if it's a local press or a New York-based press. And the key is it tells a really exciting, passionate story. Just like the stories we just heard from Robert and Patience, right? These are the types of stories that intrigue us, that provoke us, that make us cry, that make us angry, that make us joyful. And it's all in this book, Night Riders. And so you may never have heard of the publisher, but you know the story and the pitch in this story. And I want to talk about pitches. How do you pitch a book to an editor? You have, or we have, as writers together, I'll kind of talk about this as a conspiracy. We're all writers for the purpose of this event. So we have 30 seconds to a minute to pitch our book. That's what we have. And it doesn't sound like a lot of time. That's really an eternity of time. And all you need to do is to have a really good story. So the way that Phil Owen Wright Sr. pitched his book, Night Riders, was, everyone knows my father. I'm speaking as if I'm him. Phil Owen Wright's father was Thomas A. Wright Sr., one of the most incredible civil rights activists in the history of the state. Like, everyone knew him. And if you're familiar with the civil rights movement, you especially knew him. But no one knew what it was like to be a child of Reverend Wright and what it was like to be in the house, his house, when it was shot into, when it was bombed, when the family literally had to leave in the dead of night one terrible evening in St. Augustine and flee to this town. No one knew that story. They knew the story of Thomas A. Wright, the nationally known civil rights activist, the friend of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how Phil Owen Wright sold this book, was he said, I can give you the family and the child's perspective of what it was like to be in the movement, kind of behind the scenes. And that sold this book. And to me, that's really a great lesson. I'm really honored to be involved in that. But I want to go now to talk about, just kind of give you a little bit of history behind my book, African American and Latinx History of the United States, because that book in many ways encapsulates the theme of today's talk. So if you want to do the next slide, please. Oh, I can do the next slide. Okay, better, even better. Okay, right. So the 30-second pitch for this book is that I made to the editor was, this book's going to blow your mind. Well, it was a little more concrete than that. It was basically, I'm going to place Haiti and Mexico and Cuba at the center of U.S. history from the very beginning of U.S. history and change the way you think about history. That's the pitch. That's it. And everything else flows from that pitch. Now, here, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to introduce new characters into the story. one of the things that editors, especially those working in the field of history, say is, can you give us new characters? The standard characters we have in the history textbooks are so dull and boring, like Alexander Hamilton, like Monroe, like Madison. I mean, you really have to take a lot of license to make any of them very interesting. So I can, and they're in the book, don't get me wrong. I think they should be in there because this book, FM Latinx History, is really a US history textbook from 1776 to the present. So Madison and all the others belong in there, but these are the characters I'm really very, very interested in. And one of the exciting things about this book I was able to do is to really bring people together. The second pitch of this book is that US history has always been nationalistic, and that's a grave error. We need to think about this country in a relationship to Mexico, to Cuba, to Haiti. We're in a hemisphere here. We're in the Americas. What about that? The argument is you can't understand US history by just focusing on the US. How I got that was, and this kind of builds on what Robert and Patience were saying, leaving the country, being in Central America, working on my own in special forces, you kind of work on your own. I was fast-tracked into that because I'm a third-generation military veteran. I grew up in a gun culture. So, I found myself as a 20-year-old special forces sergeant working on the border of Nicaragua and Honduras in 1984. But one of the things I was able to learn working alone, because I wasn't in big units, was I had the chance to talk to people in country. Do y'all know what that phrase in country means? Indian country. I didn't know that when I first went in the military, but the phrase that we use in special forces, when you're in combat zone, you're in country, it means Indian country. Oh, isn't that interesting? And so one of the first things I started learning from people was the US looks a lot different from the perspective of someone who lives in Honduras or Colombia or Venezuela and who have been subjects of US foreign policy for nearly 2 centuries now. It looks very different. And so I started learning US history from a very different vantage point outside of the country, more objectively, one could argue. So these characters that are really integral to the book, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Antonio Maceo, Jose Marti, they're all characters who you'll see throughout the book, as the book kind of proceeds. The third pitch about this book is that US history is a history of social movements for justice, that none of the rights that we currently have, especially if you're a Black and brown person, were given to you by the government. None of them. They all were fought for by ancestors, by allies, many of whom had to die to earn those rights. If you were an abolitionist editor or writer in the Midwest in the 1850s, did you enjoy freedom of speech? Abstract, yeah, but at any point, a mob of people could come into your press, kidnap you, take you out, torture you, and kill you and burn your house down or your press down. So that's where our rights came from, social movement, struggles. The last chapter of the book kind of brings it full circle. And it's about the largest general strike in the history of the Americas. And you want to know why the book is banned? I'm kind of telling you right now why it was banned. The largest general strike in the history of the Americas occurred during our lifetimes. Some of us were probably involved in it. It was in 2006. In California, we called it a day without Mexicans. And it was the largest strike in the history, not only of this country, but in the entire Americas. Shut down entire sectors of the economy. Millions of Mexican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, Dominican, Guatemalan, et cetera, workers refused to work that day. Many allies, many African-Americans, many Anglo workers refused to work that day as well. Shut down entire sectors of our economy. Trucking, agricultural, food processing, manufacturing in the upper Midwest ground to a halt. You may never have heard of this because the mainstream media didn't like what was happening. because it was an example of people, many of whom are quote unquote undocumented, demonstrating the power they have fighting against injustice. So this is a story that I argue in my last chapter of the book. That strike is integral to the election of the first Black president in the history of this country. The Latino workers and organizers who became politicized because of that strike were the foot soldiers for then Senator Barack Obama's ground game from Nevada to California. And all of those states, the people who were on the phones, the people who went door to door, the people who stuffed envelopes, many of them were workers who became active in the 2006 general strike. So another very important part of African-American Latinx histories in the United States is that when we think about racism, we think about these terms like intersectionality, and we think about the fact that white supremacy has been a powerful, ubiquitous force all throughout US history. This is a sign that wasn't so long ago. This is a sign that my father and his generation of Mexican Americans grew up with in Houston. And in fact, my father remembered a sign like this in the first restaurant he worked in Houston, Texas, before he went into the Marines. And he said, though, it didn't bother him that much because he said, look, we weren't even allowed to walk in the front door of the restaurant. So we never saw this sign really from the front. We saw it from the back, kind of looking out, and it was backwards anyway, so you couldn't really tell what it is. But this is a big part of the book, is to understand that racism in the US has always been very complex. It's never been just a matter of black and white. It's always been multifaceted, just as the struggle against racism has been multifaceted. This is the outline of the book. And again, I think one of the reasons that the book has been targeted for banning has been, well, number one, it's sold pretty well. It hasn't sold 1 million copies, so I'm way behind Robert, but it's sold pretty well. And the reason I'm mentioning this to you is that the people buying it are not the typical reading audience. So the book is in audiobook form, it's in Kindle, it's in all the wonderful different formats. A lot of people really gravitating towards this book are first generation immigrants, labor organizers, teachers involved in anti-racist education, a lot of teachers in Florida who are, oh my gosh, teaching critical race theory. Whew, another band, people interested in the 1619 historical curriculum, which has also been banned in Florida. But the thing that has made this book, I think that out of all the books I've worked on really take off, it isn't anything I did. Any honest author, and I'm sure Robert would say this about his wonderful book, Chicken Hawk and the Vietnam War, it's timing. Timing is everything. And so the fact that this book came out during the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement was everything. That's really was the key to this book and its popularity. And it's the Black Lives Matter movement that has sparked this counter offensive by the state. By states like Florida, Texas, the Supreme Court, because the people who run this system, the American ruling class, and we do have a ruling class, just like Europe, just like any other nation, despise the Black Lives Matter movement. They despise it in part because they understand that the Black Lives Matter movement, among other things, is asking us to look at ourselves in the mirror very honestly about our history, about our present, about our future. The Black Lives Matter movement is a historical movement in the sense that I can tell you the first Hispanic Heritage Month after the resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement in the spring of 2020, I will never forget, because my speaking engagements for just Hispanic Heritage Month tripled. And if it wasn't for Zoom, I couldn't have kept up with them. I literally had an event or two every single day. Because when people went out there in the streets and protested, they began to say, it's got to be more than just about a protest. It's got to be about how did we end up electing a white supremacist for president number one? How do we end up with the largest prison population per capita in the world? How do we end up, if my US, and my students would be very candid with me, that's the other root of this book, by the way. I mentioned my experiences in military going overseas, Central America. But another profound experience for me that the book is rooted in is my students asking me, you know, if my textbook is right, Professor Ortiz, the US should be becoming freer and more progressive and more enlightened. It sure doesn't seem that way. So try again, right? This book was a try again. And I actually had to revise a lot of things I've written earlier about certain topics like Reconstruction. And if you look at chapter 4, every chapter in this book is, for me, a very humbling experience, because in Reconstruction, when I went back and looked at my own writings on Reconstruction, I realized I had really blown it. I wrote about Reconstruction as if it was an event in the United States whose major significance was limited to the United States. I mean, W.E.B. Du Bois taught us better than that back in 1935. Reconstruction was an international event. When African Americans fought and won their emancipation at the end of the US Civil War, the first thing they did, and I begin chapter 4, and I try to think about the other thing about selling a book to an editor is you have to be provocative. You have to give them an idea they've never heard before or is going to make them sit up straight in their seat. So the idea framing chapter 4 is African Americans at the end of the Civil War believed that emancipation in one country was not enough. That's the whole chapter essentially there. And so immediately the leading Black abolitionists say, well, it's great that we have our freedom, but we're not sure about that even. Juneteenth, that's the story of Juneteenth, right? But what about Cuba? What about Brazil? What about lingering serfdom in Russia? And these were all matters that African American abolitionist societies, with their millions of members, were vitally concerned about. And so they went immediately, they pivoted towards Cuba, because Cuba, at the time the US Civil War was dying down, a new war of liberation breaks out in Cuba. And so that is the repurposing of the radical kind of Black abolitionist movement. And that's chapter 4. Chapter 5 is a phrase, and this gets back to, you know, something Robert said about, you know, how generation after generation of us end up in places like Vietnam or the Philippines or Nicaragua or Iraq or Afghanistan. And in the late 19th century, the Black freedom struggle said the reason that the US is an imperial nation is because of US banks. Did you know that the US invaded and occupied Haiti for almost 2 decades, concurrently with invading and occupying the Dominican Republic for over a decade, concurrently with invading and occupying Honduras, concurrent with invading and occupying Colombia? Sometimes I don't know, how do we do it? How do we have so much energy, right? It's really remarkable. And so the book is very much a book about the struggle against colonialism and the forging of anti-colonial movements across borders. And my argument is that in the US, on the one hand, you have this terrible history of war, that wars that people like me and like Robert and others have been pushed into year and generation and decade after decade. But the pitch I'm making in this book is equally important, is we also have an equally long and powerful history of anti-imperialism. And that's in the book as well. And I believe that's probably why a lot of people don't like the book, especially powerful people, because they're like, well, you know, we don't know about this anti-imperial thing. And I talk about capitalism too. How can you talk about racism and the struggle for freedom unless you talk about capitalism? And one of the fun things about this book in particular is I've been able to talk about it to a lot of corporate people. So my Hispanic Heritage Month and my Black History Month have become international in the sense that I've given talks about this book to folks at Deutsche Bank, Bank of America, Wayfair, Microsoft, kind of the list goes on and on. And when these corporations contact me, at first I thought, oh my gosh, Bank of America, did they read chapter 5, the government of American banks? But I realized, and I think this could be an example of what is it Governor DeSantis says he hates woke capitalism, right? The exciting thing to me about the time we live in now, there's a lot of things that aren't exciting, but one of the exciting things is that more and more people are questioning this system that we live in that needs to be questioned. And friends, some of them are within these big corporations. The person who arranged the talk I gave for Bank of America International is the head of the not racketeering brand. I would say the racketeering brand, the money laundering division, which Bank of America, which fights money laundering in banks, not promote it, right? Okay. But the thing is, I think, again, I take this back to the Black Lives Matter movement. I'll say the term kids and high schools who are demanding a different kind of history curriculum. One of the things I've talked to, new immigrant kids, fairly new first generation to the country, they want to know, like, where do our ancestors fit in here? And oh, by the way, we're not really into that assimilation thing anymore. Like, I grew up with this idea that you had to assimilate to a certain standard. But if your ancestors were people like, if you have people like Antonio Maceo and Jose Marti in your country's national history, why would you assimilate away from that? The pitch in the book is that the people from the global South, whether it's the Caribbean or South America or Africa, bring their own democratic traditions to the United States. They don't have to assimilate to anything. If anything, we are assimilating to them. If you think about the histories of the farm worker movement, the CIO in the 1930s, most of those organizers were people who were first generation Americans. You had an industrial union movement of 5 million plus people. Most of the key people in that movement as organizers were African Americans and or people who had been in this country one generation. They were not assimilating to anything. They were creating new structures, new possibilities of democracy. So let me jump a couple other slides. Another thing I talk a lot about in the book is racial oppression. I don't use the term intersectionality in the book, but if you look at these murals, and these are murals that you can find in Mexico City, at the foreground, I apologize for the resolution is not so good on these, but in the foreground, these are really tragic, horrific stories. These are stories, by the way, the Mexican government had a tremendous enterprise at the end of the revolution in the 20th century. They commissioned a number of the world's greatest artists, who just happen to be Mexican, to paint, to write, to depict 4 centuries of history, 4 centuries of struggle, not just in Mexico, but the entire hemisphere. And the reason they did that was they said, people have a tendency to forget. And we love books, love museums, love libraries, but we've got to place our history out in the public. It's got to be in the street. It's got to be in the wall. You could accidentally walk into any small, medium-sized town in Mexico or Central America for that matter and run into a historical mural. And in the foreground of these murals is a lot of suffering, tragedy, indigenous people, African people being enslaved, being burned alive, literally. But in the background is equally important. In the backdrop, it's survival. It's people bearing witness. It's endurance. It's the people who are going to tell these stories and pass them on and live to fight another day. So these horrific things happened in Mexico at a time when it was impossible to think about the country becoming free, but not too long after is the Mexican War of Independence. That's chapter 2 in the book. And my argument is that the Mexican War of Independence from 1810 to 1821 is decisive on the development of the United States in a number of different ways. I can't tell you all the ways because then you wouldn't buy the book, but I'll tell you a few of them. One is Mexico abolishes slavery far earlier than the United States does. Mexico offers sanctuary to enslaved African Americans who can escape to Mexico. And they're so effective at doing so that even before Mexico becomes a nation, the US tries to sue Mexico for loss of what? Our property. Check that out, our property. And it's pointed out to them, well, we can't sue Mexico because they're not really a nation yet. There's no one to sue. Then the third thing, and this gets back to the imperial theme, imperialism, anti-imperialism, is that from the very outset, the Mexican Constitution develops a philosophy of non-intervention. That is, they learned something that the US didn't learn. Well, unfortunately, the US did learn too well from our British masters. But the Mexican people learned from their European masters that colonialism and imperialism and occupation and burning villages to the ground is not a good thing. And so we're going to create a constitution which precludes us from doing those things. But to do that, you have to do a lot of things. One of the things is you have to write that into your constitution, this idea of non-intervention. So when I talk to peace groups in the United States, and they're saying, where can we get ideas for, building an anti-war movement in the US? I say, have you ever studied the Mexican Constitution? That's a good place to go. That's a nation, for Mexico to actually wage war on anyone is like a major act. It's a big deal, it's very difficult. The other thing, and I'll kind of move towards the conclusion, is the role that Haiti has played in US history. And this just goes through chapter 2, the early iterations of the Mexican Constitution, which was created even before Mexico gains independence from Spain. And the linchpin, again, is the abolition of slavery and discrimination based upon castes. And early on in Mexico, and this is part of the drama of the early part of the book, and this is where I talk a lot about the US founding fathers because they play a role in this story. Mexico goes to the United States during their War of Independence and asks for an alliance. And they send deputations directly to President James Madison at the time. And they say, hey, President Madison, we think it would be a good idea if our nations formed a strong alliance together. Because the Europeans want everything we have. Their history in this hemisphere. That they actually just burned your capital to cinders. You had to run away. Luckily, you had your Constitution under your arm, but you ran away quickly. But see, the thing is that they're coming back. We know that the French, the British, the Dutch, all of them want what we have in the Americas. So let's form a coalition. Let's form a bond, an alliance. There's so much you can teach us in Mexico, and there's so much we can teach you. People ask me, what was the most exciting piece of research connected to this book? And it may have been going through James Madison's papers and finding this letter written by Jose Maria Morelos. It's one of the, for me as a historian, this is one of the greatest moments of my professional life, to see this letter, to read it, to have people look at it, translated the letter. It's so incredibly powerful. And it's one of these great what if moments. That's the thing I like to tell people writing history is, don't just think about what happened, think about what could have happened. Those of us who know US history know the outcome of this, but it's important for us to go back and think, what could have happened? How could our history have been different if James Madison would have said yes? Just think about that. And my students love to think about that because they're in that moment of challenging and thinking about how can we build a different world that's better than the world we live in now. That's exactly what Jose Morelos was thinking about in 1815. Because, books that challenge ideas that challenge the status quo are getting banned now because the people in charge of our system and government understand that young people, what's that old phrase? The youth are getting restless, right? For years, I've taught about the Chicano blowouts that happened in the late 60s, where thousands of Chicano kids walked out of school in East Los Angeles. Garfield High School was the epicenter. They walked out. That's a critical part of the Chicano civil rights movement. The United Farm Workers history is bound up in that as well. And I always thought, wow, what a cool era to live in, where high school kids go on strike and the demand is the right to read more. We want to read our parents' history. What did our ancestors do to build this country? It's always been so exciting to teach that, but imagine what it's like to live that. Because all over this country right now, high school kids are walking out. We just had a big walkout in Florida, right? Just a couple of months ago, much bigger than the media let on, by the way. A lot of my students have connection to students who walked out. And a lot of them walked out in protest against the Don't Say Gay bill. They don't care what the state of Florida said about it. They said, we have certain beliefs in freedom and equality, and we're going to live those out. And see, again, that's why so many things are getting banned today, because the people in charge of the system are terrified. They can feel the earth moving under their feet, and they think that by banning books, they're going to stop it. I don't think so. So kind of, I want to leave time for Q&A, but a big part of my work has to do with African-American and Latino freedom movements, sometimes working together, but oftentimes working on parallel lines. Earlier, I showed you a picture of Jose Marti, and one of the exciting things I discovered was that when he was writing about lynching, and he was living in exile in Mexico for a time, he comes to the US, he's trying to build support for the Cuban War of Liberation. He was writing about some of the same lynchings that I.D.B. Wells was writing about. And when you read the two side by side, their accounts of lynching are of the same atrocities are very similar. They're trying to give voice to the victims, number one, which was radically different than what the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Atlantic Constitution. If you read about lynching and reported from any one of those newspapers, the perspective is always the white perspective. Isn't that interesting? But when Jose Marti or I.D.B. Wells Barnett wrote about lynching, they wrote about it from the perspective of the victim of the lynching. And Jose Marti wrote about this so eloquently because he was trying to tell people all throughout Latin America, these are our brothers and sisters who are being brutalized. We need to have them at the forefront of our mindset when we're thinking about liberation. That's exactly the language that he used. And if we're ever thinking about getting free in the Caribbean or in Latin America, this is issue number one. It's not what's happening in Cuba or Mexico, it's about what's happening in the US to Black people. And to me, that's really what I refer to this as emancipatory internationalism. And that's one of the main themes of the book, this notion that I might think I'm free, but if my neighbor isn't free, how free am I? We may be talking about building liberation in Florida, but if people in Texas are not free, what is that? Okay, so that's part of for me, was part of the excitement of writing the book. And I'll just kind of close on this. What a great person to conclude on. Frederick Douglass, not the person you invite to give a talk at your fraternity or sorority, by the way. Not the person to invite to give a talk if you want to feel good about how things are going. What to the Negro is your 4th of July? I'm surprised you even invited me, but because you did invite me, I'm going to give you peace of my mind. So in this case, it's just beginning to dawn on people that this is going to be a long and bloody civil war. And Frederick Douglass was invited to the National Hall, which is this iconic place in American history, to give a talk. And the idea was he was asked to give a talk that would boost the morale of people in the North as they were, girding their loins for this holy crusade, to keep the Union together. And like I said, if you're inviting someone to give you a feel-good speech, Frederick Douglass is not the person to invite. So he came and he rained on everyone's parade. Now, I'm not going to read this, but I do have the whole quote in the book. And this kind of encapsulates the major themes of my writing as I've developed as a writer. Because what Douglass is saying is that you think the Civil War is bad, you think you're fighting on the right side, but I came here to tell you that you're the ones that caused this war. Number one, look at what you've done. Let's just run through a list of things you've been up to over the past 10, 20, 30, 40 years. You have invaded Mexico, you have mobbed the abolitionists, you have waged war on indigenous peoples, you have refused to recognize Haiti and Liberia. Sorry, y'all, but you brought this on yourselves. You didn't think there'd be any consequences. But the consequence now is the bloodiest civil war, one of the bloodiest civil wars in history. And the reason Douglass is saying this is that he wants us again to understand how your freedom is bound up in my freedom. If you're enslaved, I'm enslaved. And if we're going to take the high road in terms of saying, we don't want war, we want peace and justice, then we have to be consistent. But invading Mexico to extend slavery and then saying you're fighting a war against slavery is not consistent. So he's saying, get right. Get it clear in your head. And so if you want to be against slavery, that's great, but be against slavery. If you want to argue that you shouldn't invade other sovereign nations, that no nation should do that, then don't invade other sovereign nations. That's what Douglass is saying. That this is one of the reasons, by the way, Frederick Douglass had to leave this country, and he had to kind of be incognito on more than one occasion, because people would literally go livid when he would say things like this. One of my regrets, and a writer has to always be honest about regrets, is I wasn't able to get poetry into the book. I really wanted to get poetry into the book. But Beacon said, you have 200 pages to tell the story from 1776 to present. So that was a challenge. So poetry didn't get in. But if I put any poetry in, it would be Martin Espada would probably be foremost. And you may know that he just won the National Book Award for poetry. He's probably this nation's greatest poet. And this idea about connecting slavery to the Holocaust, to the struggle against European conquistadores, this idea we have to think about oppression as combined, but liberation as connected, again, intersectionality, if you will. To me, that's kind of what I've been trying to really get at in my writings. I didn't talk about the newest book, People Power, which is an edited volume, but I'd be happy to talk about that or answer any questions you have at this point. Thank you for being such a patient audience. Yes, please.
I'm just wondering, who's saying that?
Well, the latest thing I've heard at HuffPost was a lot of this is happening in Texas. And people call, yeah, but, well, when I first moved to Florida, people told me, and I just finished Emancipation Betrayed, and people told me informally that they were going to make sure, actually, there was someone in our school district here who said, Paul, that book is way too harsh for the schools. And so we're going to, and they said, we like Remembering Jim Crow, which is a book I co-edited, but Emancipation Betrayed is just too harsh. Interestingly enough, I'm just finishing a new essay on the Ocoee Massacre. That was one of the things that people thought was too harsh in the original book published in '05. And I had many people tell me, look, we don't want to talk about the Ocoee Massacre. It doesn't fit our idea of what Florida is. And guess what? Books make a difference, because the book was instrumental in getting the state, I worked a lot with Senator Bracey to get the state of Florida to pass a law saying that every school district now in this state has to teach about the Ocoee Massacre. The Ocoee Election Day Massacre, which occurred in this state, November 2nd, 1920. Now, the problem with that is twofold. One is it's an unfunded mandate. Number two is no teacher as a student in the state of Florida that I know of learns about the Ocoee Massacre in college, nor in high school. And so the challenge for us as historians, and what we've been able to do in the Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, is do these kind of ad hoc teachers workshops and talks on the Ocoee Massacre. But that was an event which people had a very hard time with in Emancipation Betrayed. And a lot of people didn't believe it. And I would say, look, it was internet, they had European newspapers had articles on it, Latin American newspapers had articles, there's sworn testimony. But 20 years later, now it's a requirement to teach in Florida schools. Yeah.
How long did it take you to research? And what was most of your research time?
Well, Sheila, I'm glad you answered that question, because you did a lot of the research. And we worked together for both of these books, Emancipation Betrayed and African American Latinx History of the U.S. A lot of it was done, especially the first book, in the Library of Congress, looking at NAACP papers, looking at Congress of Racial Equality papers. A lot of my research, and this is ironic because I direct an oral history program, but most of my research is archival and looking at old newspapers. And Sheila and I would go to Duke University every summer for a number of years and just look at old newspapers, and especially the old abolitionist and African-American press. It's key, if you're going to try to get an alternative vision of US history, to try to find other sources. So for example, the New York Times would write about a character, a person like Augusto Sandino in Nicaragua, who's fighting the US Marine invasion in the 20s. And guess how the New York Times would depict him? He was a murderer, he was a looter, he was this terrible person. But when you went to Black newspapers at the same time, they would say, he's fighting for his people's freedom, same as George Washington would have. What's so bad about him? And so that research was really important. But even before that, though, I'll say that oral history is what has continuously allowed me to do the kind of work that I do, which, for example, in Emancipation Betrayed, it was the oral histories with Black elders who told me something terrible had happened around Orange County in 1920. Now, they weren't old enough to remember the event specifically, but they knew something had happened. And so those were the interviews that led me into the archives and kept me looking. And that's why oral history is so vital, I think, to my work. Yeah.
It's not Florida, but in relation to what you were saying, I mean, how do we explain something, for example, like the Tulsa massacre? What happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma?
Yeah.
I never heard the word of it.
Well, and again, this is where it's a great question. How do we explain the Tulsa Massacre? How do we explain the Ocoee or Red Summer or the Elaine Massacre? The Elaine Massacre, we've been asked back in 2019, the UF Oral History Program, we actually have been working there every summer, helping them to document and tell the story of what happened in the Elaine Massacre, where federal troops came and murdered hundreds of African Americans and connected to Tulsa. Why this happens is, I'm glad Ronnie asked this question, the essay I'm finishing right now on the Ocoee massacre, I try to bring together Ocoee, Elaine, and Tulsa to a certain extent, although each of them have distinctive, histories and such. But here's a commonality. Again, so much goes back to W.E.B. Du Bois, right? If that's one of my number one rules as a historian, if you need to learn more about what's happening, go to Dr. Du Bois. So what Du Bois teaches us, those first 20 years of the 20th century leading up to the Tulsa Massacre in 1921, leading up to Ocoee in 1920, leading to Elaine in 1919, is that in spite of white supremacy, in spite of the fact that Florida has the highest lynching rate per capita of any state in the Union, far higher than even its closest second competitor, African Americans are making tremendous economic, social, and political strides. By the eve of the Great Depression, for example, in Florida, Black farmers, about 40% of all Black farmers own their own farms. We run that by, again, 40% of Black farmers own their own farms. Now, they're not plantations, by and large, they're not enormous, they're not agribusiness, but it's something. Tulsa, what's the narrative there? Black people own their own businesses and people in the county own their own farms. Elaine, what's the story? It's not a big town, but the rate of Black land ownership in Elaine and around in Phillips County in the rich alluvial lands of the Arkansas Delta, high Black farm ownership. And what's the commonality in the wake of these massacres? And I call them pogroms, is powerful white real estate interests and farmers and developers end up with those lands that they have to this day. The Orange County Regional Center, which has an incredible exhibit on the Ocoee Massacre, has estimated at a very conservative level that the land that was confiscated from Black farmers in Ocoee who were forced to leave is worth over $10 million right now. And remember, Ocoee was a pretty small settlement compared to like Tulsa. But I'm sorry for the roundabout, the elliptical response to a very direct question. The short answer of why all these violent things happening is that Black people were making tremendous economic strides. Remember at that time, the same time as Tulsa too, they're leaving the South, Black people leaving the South in large numbers, moving to Chicago, New York, St. Louis, and becoming active politically, registering to vote, beginning to be the swing vote. Not nationwide yet, but even statewide in Illinois. One of my former grad students, Mike Brandon, says Black people were the swing vote in Illinois politics, statewide elections by I think Mike says 1917. Guess what else happens in 1917? The East St. Louis Massacre, okay? The Chicago Massacre is just 2 years later. So these things, these are, the white ruling class is trying to tamp down because despite their best efforts, Black people are making progress. The NAACP by 1921 is over a decade old. It already has impressive victories. Smith v. Allred, very important Supreme Court decision. Anyway, let me stop there. But does that kind of answer the? Yeah.
It's really a fundamental question. Who sets the policy for which books are used in the state system for high school?
Well, right now, school districts have a tremendous impact on which books are used. Now, that's a little, but you're asking, that question is a little bit out of my, maybe someone here knows more than I do. Texas plays a big role because a lot of publishers of at least history textbooks are based in Texas. So the South, as always, drives national politics. But increasingly, and I think with the new laws coming into being, like the anti-woke law, and then the rule that was passed on July 4th, 2021, which bans critical race theory and the 1619 curriculum. An argument about that is that's taken tremendous power away from even local school districts in picking their own books. Yeah. Yeah.
Paul, it's been a fascinating talk. Let's give Paul a big hand. And we have-
Thank you. Oh, thank you. That is so cool. Thank you.
You may not be able to get them after today, so, go buy lots of books.
Yeah. Right.
Thank you. Pat, can you come up again? Pat Cairn is our chairperson, and she has worked endlessly for months to make this festival happen. And we just want to give her a big round of applause and give her a thank you. Oh, thank you. I wasn't expecting this. Thank you all for coming. And there's some books for sale from Paul back there. Grab a snack if you want to before you go. But thank you all for being a part of the Sunshine State Book Festival. We appreciate your support and see you next year.